would love to thank the two departments that came in together, the Department of History and the Department of Political Sciences. These two departments belong into the different schools, but because we are promoting multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, we are having politicians in the house, we are having the historians, we are having the artists, we are having so many different colleagues who are wearing different hats in the College of Human Sciences. If Robert Sobukwe was alive today, he was gonna turn 100 years. That's why we are saying it's a centenary celebration of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. I will leave some space for Prof. Hlabangani to share with you, but what I can say, we are here today to celebrate Iqhawe. If you know the meaning of Iqhawe, Ingalabutho, a soldier, an icon, a diligent worker, a brave soldier who was not afraid of any consequences. He stood firm in his beliefs. Robert Sobukwe was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary and founding member of PAC. For the young generation in the house, I want you to learn that he was a member of ANC, but because of his dissatisfaction, where no results were yielded, he took a left corner and said, I'm here. I believe that as African, we've got our African problems which can be solved by the Africans themselves. So he believed in Africanist future, that Africans can solve their own problems, can liberate themselves, and also he was results driven. As we are all here, I know we've got our responsibilities. Robert Sobukwe wanted to see the results. He did not want to see into engaphumeleli. He just wanted to see the results. On the 21st of March, we all celebrated Human Rights Day. For the young generation that is in the house, today we are celebrating 100 years of Robert Sobukwe. He is the organizer and the leader of that peaceful march that happened in 21 March 1960. So you just need to remember that we are celebrating a giant who wanted to make sure that nobody is discriminated in this country. He organized this march in fighting against the pass laws. Why must everybody go and carry the passbook? So we are celebrating that man. He was arrested and sentenced to 3 years. If you go deep into the history, you learn that after 3 years, the higher authorities have a Sobukwe clause where his sentence was checked, rechecked. He continued even after finishing his sentence, and then he was sent to Robben Island on solitary confinement. If you understand solitary confinement, solitary, you are all by yourself. You are here. You stay here, you sleep here, you eat here, you do everything here. For us, from the medical fraternity, when you misbehave and you are out of order, we put you in solitary confinement because we don't want you to disturb other patients who have come with different ailments. If you go to a psychiatric institution, you'll notice that there are so many wards that are termed solely confinement units. You must just imagine what kind of torture a person went through. So Robert Sobukwe stayed there for 6 years, and then he did not say, I'm going to change my tune. He continued to say, I'm here for the support of my African people. He stood against all odds, and then he was determined to see the outcome of his journey. Unfortunately, he succumbed to lung cancer, and that's where he ended up. During his tenure, he was a teacher, a lecturer, a scholar, and a lawyer. I'm talking about a brave man who wanted to make sure that Africans get what belongs to them and also things are done correctly. I told you earlier on that I will allow Prof. Hlabangani to go in depth and share with us. What I've picked up from the theme is that it says Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity, and Afrofuturism. And then when we look into it, it's intertwined. And then we've got our three main keynote speakers who are going to unravel this theme. We've got Prof. Kwesipra, who is our emeritus professor. He's going to give us the legacy of Robert Sobukwe, and then we're going to learn more on what did Robert Sobukwe believed in, because we have heard a little bit that he wanted Africans to liberate themselves. And then we've got our international visitor and a scholar, Prof. Na Dove, who's going to dwell into African womanism and link it with futurism. And then we've got our own Prof. Mkhube Ramose, who's going to remind us of Ubuntu principles, because his philosophy is embedded on Ubuntu principles. And then Prof. Makanya as a sociologist and also supporting Prof. Pra. You know, you don't leave this collaboration. You keep going even if you are on retirement. Ladies and gentlemen, the organizing committee posed this question to all of us. What does it mean to reflect on Robert Sobukwe's views, values, and ideologies within the neo-colonialist context of state capture, worsening security, and economic outlook? With those few words, ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying welcome to the conference, and we hope that we'll unravel these questions that are affecting our country. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nkosi. Moving on with the program, before we call upon the next speaker to come to the podium, I would just like to acknowledge the presence of very esteemed colleagues in our College of Human Sciences. Now that the next speaker has been mentioned, Professor Hlabangani, I thought I should also acknowledge other very important people in our college. The first is our Deputy Executive Dean, Professor Mashau. Please show yourself, Prof. Thank you. And then the Department of History falls within the School of Humanities, which has a director, and the director of the School of Humanities is among us, and that's Professor Madise. Please show yourself, Prof. In our college, we also have the School of Arts. The director of the School of Arts is also among us, Professor Charlie. Thank you, Prof. Right, another colleague I would like to acknowledge within the College of Human Sciences, who heads our graduate studies and research, Professor Onyancha is among us. Please, Prof. Thank you very much. I will acknowledge other colleagues, important colleagues in our college as we go along. But right now, let me call upon Professor Nokuthula Hlabangani, who is the head of quality assurance in our College of Human Sciences. Thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Izwe lethu. We must therefore appreciate our role. We must appreciate our responsibility. The African people have entrusted their whole future to us, and we have sworn that we are leading them, not to death, but to life abundant. These are the words of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. 2 years ago, we hosted a teaching and learning festival in the College of Human Sciences where one of the keynote speakers was the esteemed Professor Odora Hoppers, who really went to town, inviting us to reflect on this distinction, this distinction between a soldier and a warrior. She argued that a soldier is somebody who follows orders. A soldier will be distinguished through the garb that they are wearing. A soldier works within a hierarchy. A soldier perpetuates the status quo. Whereas in juxtaposition, a warrior does not wear a uniform as such, but takes very seriously the ideals of their people and carries them upon themselves. A soldier would not necessarily work in a hierarchy. A warrior does not work very well in a hierarchy, in that sometimes it is upon spontaneous demand that they are supposed to take on this role. Prof. Nkosi did say that I'm not the Vice Chancellor. I am not. Only this morning was I asked to fill in these big shoes. And I will reiterate, we must therefore appreciate our role. We must appreciate our responsibility. The African people have entrusted their whole future to us, and we have sworn that we are leading them not to death, but to a life in abundance. I will read from my very rough notes, Ma Africa. Who then is Robert Sobukwe, that he would be entrusted with this very gigantic theme of this conference? A closer look at this theme really invites us to think about the various keywords contained therein and what might they mean then for the discussions that we are going to have these 3 days. On that note, let me also, in the first instance, observe protocol. It has already been laid. Also acknowledge really the visionary leadership of the organizers of this conference, who, as we know, all of us are caught up in the lean times of neoliberalism. All of us are caught up in surviving the everyday. But they had the fortitude and the foresight to lift up their heads from this everyday red race and begin to invite us to have this conversation that is not only looking backwards, but is also very relevant for today, but is also giving us a glimpse of what a future would have looked like had history unfolded in different ways. So I'd really like to pay tribute to this vision that has brought us here this morning. When one reads, when one visits a YouTube, when one just goes on the internet, one is not very hard pressed to find a bit of this and a bit of that on Robert Sobukwe. I will not belabor the political man that he was. I rather am provoked to speak to the soul of the man. The soul that then meant that he, 100 years of Sobukwe, we gather today, this morning. Against all odds, against all machinations, against big agendas, here we are gathering. And I would like to think that a gathering such as this does not necessarily attract those whose souls are more soldier-like, but rather those that are more warrior-like. And I hope that this shows in the deliberations that we are going to have at a time when this country is in dire straits. There's no two ways about it. We can go to town recounting how astray we have come or we have gone. I will speak to the soul of the man as I understand him. I would like to posit that he's one of those whose word is his bond. At a time when we say a lot of things, at a time when even in academia, we use this language that I have a problem with, that is said we are performing. He was not a performer. He really did not go out of his way to distinguish himself. But as history would have it, and as history is a leveler, history will distinguish the man. So who is Robert Sobukwe? Prof. Nkosi gave us a bit of a background on who the man was. But I would like to posit that he's one of those who amongst us could be said to have been ahead of his time. A read on Sobukwe will tell us that he was ahead of his time. I was listening to Thando Lwethu on YouTube on this platform Moya with Ntigi Mazwai last week sometime, on Thursday I think it was. And Thando Lwethu makes a point that today we talk about non-racialism, but we cannot account for where and when, that kind of concept came from. It is from this man who, when looking, saw a picture much bigger than perhaps the subsequent ensuing history. A picture that, yet again, history is galvanizing us to confront. A picture without accounting to, we will always reach these cul-de-sacs that we have come to as a nation. And I think the sooner we reckon with the fact that we are at a no man's land, the sooner that we acknowledge that we are in a cul-de-sac, the sooner that we acknowledge that our children are not in the best standing. And as such, it is an indictment upon this trajectory that we have embarked on post that moment of 1994, the better. So I posit that Robert Sobukwe was ahead of his time. More than anything, he was driven by a deep love. A deep love for Africa, a deep love for her people. He foresaw a future whose time is now. It is on this basis that Don Matera wrote, and I think viscerally, from the depth of his being, about one who always issued from the depth of his own being, that he wrote on his death. It was our suffering and our tears that nourished and kept him alive. Their law that killed him. If the death certificate says lung cancer, there is a whole lifetime before he drew his last death. Let no digits be sung. Let's not make a big brahahu about the man. No shrines be raised to burden his memory. He did not go out of his way to distinguish himself. It is only history that will distinguish him. Sages such as he need no tombstones to speak their fame. He does not need the PR. He does not need the big machinery. He does not need a top-down kind of imposition such that he continues to live. He lives all by himself. Sages such as he need no tombstones to speak their fame. Lay him down on a high mountain. Lay him down on a high mountain, that he may look on the land he loved, the nation for which he died. Men feared the fire of his soul. The colonizer understood that of all the prisoners that could be counted on Robben Island, only one had the ability to galvanize a whole nation into a future that we were robbed of. Only one had the love so deep that he could see a future that is contra to what we have. Only one was a prophet who, when he spoke, the fire in his belly was unmistaken. Hence the clauses that came to characterize his incarceration. Hence the silences that came to characterize his afterlife. Hence the lack of acknowledgement that then was to be his fate. So he led from the front. From the pictures that we see of him, we see that he led from the front. He was a scholar who was also an activist, but more than anything, he espoused a deep love for his people. I think most importantly, and I don't think as a country we have come to understand this, even in our political activism, even in our scholar activism, we have not quite come to understand that Sobukwe gave us a template of how to do real politics. When he was asked to plead in a court, he said, "I shall not plead, because by so doing, I would then give legal weight to an illegal system." Today we partake in what could conceivably be thought of in very straight-cut ways as illegal institutions, as illegal discourses, as illegal ways of fashioning this country without so much as batting an eyelid. So I think we missed that lesson from him when he said, by pleading, by playing along, I will then give this platform legitimacy that it does not have. As I said, colleagues, Ma-Africa, that the theme is gigantic, befitting of the man. We know that he was a Pan-Africanist. We know that he did not really give traction to the borders that we inherited. We know that he was an Afrocentrist in so many ways, and perhaps this conference will begin to speak to that in very liberating ways. What does this then mean? But more than that, he was giving us a view of a future where there shall be no discrimination, there shall be no want, there shall be no aborted lives, such as we have in South Africa, as a matter of course this time. He said, here is a tree rooted in African soil, nourished with waters from the rivers of Africa, come and sit under its shade and become with us the leaves of the same branch and the branches of the same tree. I think that warrior motif that I invoked earlier on does speak to this. Here, I think he was being Afrocentrist to say that there is a tree that is rooted on African soil, from which we have the responsibility to continue to drink and become branches, worthy branches of this tree, as we make shade for the children of Africa. So, Africa, I will not belabor the point. More than anything, it is the love of the man that begot fire in his soul that I think was his greatest gift to us. A gift that if we nurture, a gift that if we take seriously in our respective preoccupations from day to day, one that will take us to the liberation that has been elusive so far. On that note, Siti Msutu, Siti Jambisa, Siti Lisa, it is not by way of protocol that we stand here. It is not by way of molao, sumteto, I don't know, by law that we sit here. It is by way of our very lives that we stand and sit this morning. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Hlabangana. You said it's big shoes indeed that you were filling, but you filled them so perfectly. Thank you very much, and at such a last minute, we really, really appreciate. Yeah. Thank you, my sister. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're tense. We're so tense. But anyway, Prof. Hlabangana took us on a deep reflection, on a journey into a deep reflection on the work, the life, the times, the views, the values of this man, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. And I think we were just a bit tense after that deep reflection. Thank you, my sister. Thank you for that song. Let's keep the songs in our hearts and the poems in our hearts coming. Please, you're welcome to do so. As long as you doesn't take you the whole hour to turn us around back into the program. Right now, we're moving on to the next item, which is messages of support. And for that, we will have Mr. Tembinkosi Khumalo coming over to read the messages of support from Dr. Mutsoko Pheko, who is a former president of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And then the next one will be from Professor Thobeka Mda, who is with the Mangaliso Sobukwe Trust. Over to you, Mr. Khumalo. I hope you are set up.
Izwe lethu ya Africa. I have too many songs. I will take the hour. Should I attempt one? Okay, let me. Bathule nje baziqiniso yimbile lendawo esikuyo. Bathule nje baziqiniso lendawo esikuyo. Awusikhokhele sobukwe lendawo esikuyo. Awusikhokhele wephama lendawo esikuyo. Izwe lethu ya Africa. You'll excuse me, all protocol observed. I'm very forgetful, so I might not remember it all, but it is my great honor to stand in front of you all to read this message from the distinguished and honorable author and leader, academic Dr. Mutoko Peko, who has been said by our chair of department, a former president of the PAC. I'm a bit dyslexic, so please bear with me in my reading. This is a message of solidarity. The Prof. Mangaliso Sobukwe Centenary International Conference, and congratulations to the Department of History in the College of Human Sciences at Unisa. Sons and daughters of Africa, distinguished guests, and dear friends of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, this 100th centenary of Prof. Mangaliso Sobukwe, it is worth reiterating what I have articulated many times, that Mangaliso Sobukwe is a shining star of the African liberation struggle of this country and the continent of Africa. A brutally persecuted and severely tested leader who passed the test with unparalleled distinction. This Pan-Africanist walked the political talk to the finish with an astounding patriotism. He is a man deeply appreciated by those who are mentally decolonized and refuse to continue to be economic drawers of water and hewers of wood for the foreigners in the land of their ancestors. This African man, affectionately nicknamed Defier of the Undefiable, Wonder Boy of South African politics, exposed the struggles of fighting white domination and black domination as a myth. Apartheid in South Africa was a product of racism that came not from black people. It was not a product of black domination. It was a creation of white domination, stemming from this superstition and unscientific theories of unschooled authors of white supremacy. Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe never called a spade a teaspoon. The land dispossessors of the African people recognized this fact. To stop him from achieving genuine liberation for his people, the apartheid colonialists regime made a special law to govern him. They called it the Sobukwe Clause. This is the only law of its kind anywhere in the world. This was a deliberate law to not only incarcerate him indefinitely, it was to forever silence his voice, thoughts, and ideas. To this day, the present government has also continued the silencing and attempting to write him out of the annals of this country's history. It is my hope that this deliberation of this critical and important international conference on Prof. Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe joins the call to release his voice recorded in courts of this country, as well as as hidden by the South African media. True to his character, he disagreed with the ANC leaders after this organization was infiltrated by white liberals calling themselves communists. These whites introduced into the ANC a document whose preamble reads, quote, "We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Black and white together equals countrymen and brother. Adopt this charter," end quote. Sobukwe knew that no colonized people anywhere in the world have ever accepted that their stolen land belongs equally to its owners and the colonizer. This Freedom Charter ignored the European Imperialist Natives Land Act of 1913, which allocated Africans their own land of 7%, while allocating 93% to colonial settlers. Sobukwe called the ANC's Freedom Charter a colossal fraud ever perpetrated upon the oppressed and degraded people. It clearly bears the stamp of its origin. It is the product of the slave mentality and colonialists. Furthermore, Mangaliso Sobukwe said, "We reject the economic exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few. We accept the equitable distribution of wealth as the only basis on which the slogan of equal opportunities can be founded." I wish to congratulate the Department of History in the College of Human Sciences at Unisa for this timely, bold, courageous initiative to host the Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe International Conference. You have made history. You are contributing to the unmuting of Sobukwe's voice. In addition, I think that deserves a round of applause. In addition, Pan-Africanism, AFROCENTRICITY, and AFROFUTURISM in the 21st century must stimulate a new pedagogy in all our curriculums. In order to decolonize the mind and enable African epistemology to emerge in our scholarship, politics, and African life. I wish you well in your conference. Long live the spirit of Mangaliso Sobukwe, long live. Long live the spirit of Mangaliso Sobukwe, long live. Izwe lethu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumalo. He is a lecturer of history in our department. Thank you very much for that. He only read one, you will have noticed. That was from Dr. Motsoko Peko. We didn't manage to get a message of support from Professor Mda, but we will, if we find space within our program, insert it as soon as we receive it. We move on to the keynote address, very important moment in this session. And the keynote address, as you see in your program, will be given by someone we all know, someone who's known very well to us, someone who's known very well to the whole world. In fact, if you don't know him, it is to your own peril. To introduce this very important speaker, I will ask Ms. Zandi Khatebe, where did she go? She went out. I'll ask her to come and introduce the keynote speaker to us. A song, a poem, while we wait. This is a very interesting conference. We don't get this in academic conferences, songs and poems just coming in just like that, unplanned and programmed. All right, while we wait, I note, let me also acknowledge one of our colleagues in the College of Human Sciences. Prof. Kobe has joined us. Prof. Kobe, please show yourself. Yes, you, Professor Fundiswa Kobe. She's quite surprised. One of the dignitaries in our College of Human Sciences, she heads our research. She heads our M&D, Masters and Graduate Studies. Sorry for that. Okay, Ms. Sandy is here. Please come over. Okay, as I said, she is going to introduce the keynote speaker to us, Professor Pra.
Ma-Africa, colleagues, friends, comrades, molweni, welcome, Siyanibulisa. Mine is just a quick one, and like Prof. Noktula, I've been ambushed. My duties are outside the hall. Perhaps before I read what I've been provided here, I should state that it does not come anywhere close to what the man that Professor Kwesi Pra is. So what you are getting, unfortunately, Ma-Africa, is but an abridged version. And it goes, Emeritus Professor Kwesi Pra is the founder of and former director of the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society, CASAS, based in Cape Town. He was educated at the University of Leiden in Amsterdam and has worked extensively across Africa, Europe, Asia, doing research and teaching sociology, anthropology in various universities, including the University of Botswana, University of Makerere, Uganda, University of Zambia, University of Juba in Sudan, University of the Cape Coast, University of Ghana, and the National University of Lesotho, Kwanali Tabeng. He also taught at the University of Namibia, the University of the Western Cape, here at home, as well as the University of Heidelberg in Amsterdam. Professor Pram has also been the Nuffield Scholar and Associate at the Center for African Studies in Cambridge University, and has served as a professor researcher and fellow at the Namibia Economic Policy Research Unit. He's lately been assisting the University of KwaZulu. Pra has written many books, including, but not limited to, The Social Background of Coups d'Etats, Brazil in 1964, Ghana in 1966, Essays on African Society and History, that was published in 1976, Beyond the Color Line, which was published in 1998, African Languages for the Mass Education of Africans in 1995. As you can see, he's been a trailblazer. Capia, a critical study of an 18th century African city in 1992, the Bantustan Brain Gain, and that was published in 1989. Mother Tongue for Scientific and Technological Development in Africa, published in 2000. And only recently are we talking about decolonizing the mother tongue and bringing it into science and technology. We need to catch up, Ma-Africa. He's also published The African Nation, The State of the Nation in 2006, and Before and After Gavi, published in 2019. And it says here, etc., etc., etc. With those words, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. You will have noticed I skipped the poem. Someone who has a craft to do this. We've all been practicing a craft we're not really skilled for, trying to sing, trying to present poems here. We've got online Mr. Zolani Prince Shapiro Jalimpi. I hope he is ready. I thought he would be the one to raise our keynote speaker to his feet. Oh, there he is. Over to you, Brazolani.
ingoma singumshela sit Yama Africa Shabelan ingoma singumshela sit Yama Africa Africanists are individuals and institutions advocating for mental decolonization of Africans, home and abroad. Africanists are our ancestors, to whom we pour libations, ever existence in our seats of emotions, spirits honored by our grandparents, amanyange ankulwa kokhokho. Africanists are traditional healers, renderers of therapeutic powers accessed in their sanctuaries, amabhule bomhlola, amagqirha namaxhele. Africanists are combatants against colonization like Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, Prof, son of the soil, non-violent gentleman, a teacher, a preacher, the fountainhead of Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. Winds of winds convey Sobukwe's messages. Brought some land that was stolen, a subject matter not to be forgotten as our liberation struggle perimeter. Give presidency to the land of our forefathers, land that means everything to us. Motherland Africa, Africa, Isoletu, Africa. One Azania, one nation, one Azania. Serve, sacrifice, suffer. There is only one human race, Sobukwe appropriately declared. For material wealth hooders in their miserable existence as they feared their mirror reflection. They feared the rise of the poor against the rich. They feared what had become of their greediness. And partitioned human race. Check your history, make it tell. Human race separation was and still is but just a device to divide and dominate. What a wreckage. In this day and age, we still swing in a cage staged by capitalist world of greed and rage. Our tribal authority has been captured. Non-governmental organizations captured. Trade unions captured. Heads of state captured. My heart bleeds. When we were farmers, hunters, and fishermen, there was no greed. African heads of states, unwrap the state of your heads. Is it not this capitalism that robbed us of Ubuntu? War over meatless bones, scavenging all over the globe. Look at your share. worm in a fish hook. Inventions of Western civilization, you stretch your arms, begging bowls in your hands. Now you need knee pads. Our ancestors must be tending in their graves, for blinded by rage of impoverishment, people don't just puke words, but paint images, ugly portraits of bent faces, disfigured and displaced features, red, dread drippings. Sons and daughters of the soil, that is who we are, resembling leaves of grass drifted by the cool of breezes, but the roots suffused in the dust of earth's crust, unshaken.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brazolani. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Prof, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I prepared for this purpose a paper which looks at the salient features of the legacy of Robert Mangalishu Sobukwe and tries to locate this within the wider process of the evolution of particularly the political economy of Africa and the world. Because too often when we try to understand societies, we isolate them, when isolation may be necessary, but societies don't live in isolation. And what happens here is a result of what happens somewhere else also sometimes. Now we tend to underestimate this, so please bear with me. I tend to expend a lot of verbiage often. It's one of the problems people like you and me have as academics. In the historical process of anti-colonialism in Africa, Mangalishu Sobukwe was the first to lead a political formation or party which identified itself as avowedly Pan-African. That's the Pan-African Congress of South Africa. Many political parties and formations would claim ideational affiliation to Pan-Africanism. But until Sobukwe's initiative, none had made that openly the front and back of its ideals. Sobukwe was singularly a man of vision, shaped by the contemporary global order and particularly the popular Africanist political ideals and sentiments of his times. Although a regular and serious Christian, Methodist, his views were not visionary attributes grounded in ecclesiastical or millenarian foundations, but rather rational farsightedness based on a succinct understanding of the historical process and also the unfettered intellectual aristocracy to lead the process and provide the necessary intellectual ballast to ideologically sustain the organization. Social theorists argue that the touchstone for the rectitude of ideas is that they should be verifiable, tried, or tested through practice. In this instance, the conceived organizational instrument he devised to pursue and bring the vision to practical fruition was envisaged to be the party, the PAC, South Africa. In Sobukwe's incandescent vision of an emerging new Africa, Pan-Africanism was a requisite formula. In Southern Africa, before and after him, nobody has equaled the zeal and conviction with which he nailed his colors to the mast of the Pan-Africanist ideal. On this, he left no room for misinterpretation or equivocation. Sobukwe professed that, and I quote, "We who are Pan-African in outlook do not subscribe to the doctrine of South African exceptionalism and are committed to Pan-Africanism and a union of African states, which we would like to see as a unitary, centrally controlled, organic whole." Unquote. On the 20th of March, 1960, that's the eve of the Sharpeville massacre, Sobukwe heralded that, and again I quote, the unfolding program which starts tomorrow ends up in 1963 with the realization of a United States of Africa, unquote. This was 1960, and he was referring to what would happen in 1963. And it was the day before the massacre. This is the political terminus for Africa he envisaged. As history has it registered, sadly, in 1963, the year he was referring to for the Union, Africans actually, in fact, only achieved an organization whose structural foundations accepted and implicitly endorsed the assumed rationality of the 1885 partition of Africa and the colonial territorial adjustments which were subsequently made after the First World War. This is very important. This is very important. What I'm trying to say there, in other words, is that the Africa we inherited and the African Union, Organization of African Union, which we inherited, and the Africa we know indeed today, is an Africa which flows directly out of European artifice, European intent in 1884-85. We did not create any of the states that we have today. We had no agency, we had no hand in these states we call nations. These states were created by Western imperialism at a time which should have, not because of evil thought or anything, but because of larger forces also, which affected the whole world. Please understand this. That the world is a whole. There are certain processes we note from the year zero to the present time. The growth of production, the forces of production, the changing relations of production in the whole world. They're linked, all linked. It's not by intent or purpose always. And this has consequences. Number two, which we see always, if you study history properly, is that there is an emancipation process, an inevitable emancipation. Human beings seek more freedom and get more freedom with time. And if you look at the history of the world, the earliest period when humans lived in bands and communities and shared everything, and children were produced or progeny were produced in communities, and everybody had a responsibility towards everybody else. Now these societies were surpassed in time. We saw the emergence of slave societies, not only in Africa, all over the world. There is no single people in the world who in history, if you go far back, have not seen institutions like slavery. Not one single one. And then that was followed by a slightly more emancipated system for the world. Which is, people are no longer owned to produce labor, but are obliged by custom and tradition to accede, alienate part of their labor as material goods or to produce services on behalf of the owner of production systems and the means of production. That sort of institution was all over the world too, even in Africa. There were castes, nobilities, aristocracies, which expected people to perform certain tasks and duties, and who could alienate the results of production from them. This you will find in all parts of the world, in fact, also. Even in Europe, as recently as 1861, Russia finally ended that system. And before that system, 2/3 of the population of Russia were working like slaves, semi-slaves. We talk about slavery as if it's just ours, but this is not true. The first human beings were taken as slaves to America by European settlers were Europeans. They were Irish people who were carried there to labor. Now, we find that in the end of the 19th century, the emergence of imperialism. And imperialism had economic consequences, but it had also social consequences. Slavery was abolished already by the British already in the 1815s, enforced in 1834. Brazil was one of the last European powers to stop it, around 1895. In the British Empire, it was enforceable in 1834. So you see, then more and more people were thrown on the labor market again. We've seen these processes are global, but it came also with demands that people want freedom, people want means to shelter. That also came after that. Remember that in a place like Europe, they want their freedoms and so on, talk about democracy endlessly. But it was only in the 1920s that women were given the vote. In Switzerland, the last pocket of laws blocking women's full rights to vote happened less than a decade ago. So the freedom process for all of us, humanity, is inexorable. Nobody can stop it. No, just like nobody can stop the rain. The rain is coming now, you can't stop it. Freedom is like that. And humanity registers freedom incrementally, slowly, coming forward. It affects us all. It starts in one end, it moves faster than the other end, but the other end also catches up. Sociologists of various sorts have come up with theories to explain this sort of thing. I remember when I was a student, I was taught Engels, the colleague of Marx, he talked about it as the law of uneven development. Jan Romein was one of my teachers. He calls it the theory of retarding lead. Another one, I think it's Severs, he calls it the law of evolutionary potentials. The society may be back at a certain stage in history, but at another stage it accelerates above those who are ahead of it. And they all affect each other in these processes unevenly. And they grow and develop. But what we can say is that freedom, the rights of people, especially on the bourgeois capitalist society, are rights like the right to vote, the right to shelter, the right to education, the right to health, is becoming a right which slowly more and more people are demanding and acquiring everywhere in the world. It will happen. That is what others call the National Democratic Revolution. That is the rise, the development of late capitalism. And the preparation, because whatever, just like the society we have, is a product of societies before. What we have also will be the foundation of what is to come in society. It will be after our time, for me, you and lots of some of us here who are close to the end of a story. Getting a bit too old. But it carries, the whole of humanity goes forward. The whole of humanity. And what happens in one end of the world has a way of affecting what happens in the next way. And it's not always because some people are scheming behind. They do that also, but they do that for money. Mainly for money, material gain. And not always, because they will use social props, conditions, to enable them to do that, extract from the others. But it's not because one group of human beings is more evil than the other. No, that's not correct. It's that the forces of production and the relations of production dictate that some are grabbing more than others, and then they challenge them. And it happens in the whole world, but it happens even in villages. It happens in all societies, it happens in villages everywhere. Now, so the 19th century saw the end of the old slave system, the beginning of global capitalism and imperialism, which came with it. And imperialism was an outflow of capitalist development in that time. You know, when trusts were created, trusts, cartels, monopolies emerged. Remember in South Africa, diamonds were discovered in 1867, Kimberley, gold, 1886. Now, this had a tremendous effect on the development of the industrial age, capitalism. It speeded up the process. The Dutch had introduced the principle of the joint stock company. They first registered in Amsterdam the principle of the joint stock company in 1602. The British had done it 2 years before, in 1600, what they call the British East India Company, which became the British East India Company. And the Dutch followed 2 years later with the Dutch, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. And 2 years later, it was a principle of joint stocks. It was a principle of capitalism advancing to another stage. And it affected the whole world. Others adopted that principle as the system grew and advanced. Now, it led to imperialism, finally, in the 19th century. And imperialism ended up, for us, with the partition of Africa under the auspices of Bismarck. In 1884, they finalized the partition in 1885, the following year, and divided up Africa as we know it more or less today. Because what they did in 1885, through imperialist rivalries, Germany had emerged. Germany had emerged a decade and a half before, because it defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. And it started under Prussia to expand, to grow. Within 15 years, we were at the Berlin Conference, because Germany wanted to be part of the imperial world, which was dominated at the time by Britain, France to a lesser extent. And they wanted a piece of cake out of it too. And Africa became the big place where this was happening. So they chopped up Africa and divided it, but it was happening all around the world. America came in later, you know, in that story. Remember America? They took Hawaii. And then there was the Spanish-American War at the end of the same time that the Anglo-Boer War was taking place here. The Americans started with a war in Cuba and divided, took Cuba and then took the Philippines etc., etc. So you see, I'm trying to explain that imperialism, we should be careful. We must see it objectively as a process, not necessarily passionately with emotion, but to be able to stand and look at it, because otherwise we won't understand how and where we should be moving to next properly. You know, we won't get that picture right. It becomes all emotion. That doesn't take us anywhere. In the world, it's just hard. Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, did in the 19th century. He made a statement that Britain has no permanent friends. They have only permanent interests. That's how this thing works, you see. Anyway, so in the First World War, which was a war of imperial rivalry, the competition between the imperial powers, they defeated Germany. They defeated Germany, and they shared the German holdings in Africa among themselves, principally the French and the English and the Belgians. They got little shares. The German share of Tanganyika, as it was called then, was given to Britain. Part of its northwestern corner, Rwanda, present-day Rwanda, Burundi, was given to Belgium, which had the Congo at that stage already. They had no regard for the people living there. They couldn't be bothered about it. It was just territorial straight lines. You could see them, straight lines all over the place. And they divide the whole place up. Again, Togo in West Africa was divided into between the French and the English. The French took half. This was after 1917, 1918. So following Versailles, 1919, the same year the first Pan-African, the second Pan-African Congress, or depending on who you took place. Now, Togo was divided up. The French Togoland, Cameroons was divided up. These were all former German holdings. I'm saying this, I'm drawing your attention to this because there is nothing holy about the states we have. They were not our creations. So let's be careful how we look at it. Our histories, the history in the southern part, for example, the conglomerates culturally, ethnoculturally, are the Nguni people, the Sutu Tswana, and the Khoisan peoples. Between the Khoisan and the Bantu peoples, the difference is in the mode of production. The San remained until recent times hunter-gatherers. The Khoi were pastoralists, transiting from hunter-gathering to pastoralism, pastoralist agriculture. The Bantu-speaking peoples were agriculturalists, principally, and pastoralists, agriculturalists. That's the real difference. It's in the economic system. That's the real difference between the two. Now, the Nguni people are in Tanzania as Chingoni. They are in Malawi, Stumbuka. Zambia, Malawi border, Chisenga they speak. Then they are in Zimbabwe as Ndebele. They are here as Ndebele, they are here as Zulu, they are Swaziland as Swati, they speak Swati. This is one historical ethno-linguistic group. My work in the past has been towards writing the language with one spelling system. If we want to make any progress, we have to be able to write, because these languages are mutually, more or less mutually intelligible. There is no heavenly or earthly reason why they should be written separately. The reason why they are written separately, please, I'm saying this in the University of South Africa. I want you to do something about this. Do something, not just talk, but do something. This language covers Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Swaziland. 7 countries. It can be written in such a way that everybody can read it within these areas, but pronounce it his or her own way. Just like an Englishman from Aberdeenshire, an Englishman from London, when they speak, this man is not speaking my language, but they can read the same thing, understand the same thing. They can laugh at each other for their differences in pronunciation, but they can read the same thing. That way it becomes viable. That way we can use our languages to move forward. Because without our languages, we cannot move forward. Please understand that. Our languages are key. We're wasting time pretending and using English and French. We can't move forward without our languages. There is no society on earth which is making progress on the basis of somebody else's language or a borrowed language. Please understand this. They laugh. Then people will laugh at us and say that these people don't know who they are. They don't even want to use. And the moment you use somebody, language is the instrument of imperialism. Every people who are colonized or dominated are dominated through language. Remember the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners fought principally also because of language. They always said it. In the 1870s, when they started calling themselves Afrikaners. And in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which we call the Anglo-Boer War, at the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the leader, Martinez, he said he was not going to sign the treaty if they won't guarantee their language to be used, written. And they got that done because they understood the importance. Their terrible leader, for our purposes, Malan, D.F. Malan, he said, lift the language and you lift the people. We cannot make progress in English. English is a colonial language. Please. And when the Afrikaners did it, in 1913, they produced the first orthography. Remember, the language was realized only in the 1870s, not so long ago. 1913, they produced the first rigid set rules of spelling. 1913, not so long ago. But in 5 years, the year they produced it, the same year is the same year they were introduced to schools. 5 years later, in 1918, it was in university. 1925, it was in Parliament. 1933, they had produced the first Bible in the language using the orthography. That is seriousness. That is understanding. That is the same amount of time that we have moved from the end of apartheid to the present time. They were able to develop the language to the point where you could study space rocketry. Now we have 30 years of post-apartheid. We're still talking about apartheid. We think you can't write. Sutu Tswana starts from Namibia. Tswana says all the way from Namibia, from Gobabis. East of Gobabis towards the Botswana border. It's all Tswana speaking. In Botswana, it's spoken by 82% of the population. The next biggest language is Kalanga, which is an extension. Kalanga is the end of the Shona cluster, which starts from Beira. You see. Now, Botswana, they say they are a nation, the Tswana nation. But there are more Tswanas here in South Africa than there. And my friend, Chief Lintwe, you remember him, of Muchudi, late. He used to tell me, I used to question him about the fact that he was all the time crossing the border to South Africa, because in those days, people like me never came to South Africa. We refused to come to South Africa. And I said, Lintwe, why are you every time going to the Republic, because we call South Africa the Republic? And he said, Kwesi, you know, those people there in Rustenburg, they are my people. I'm their chief. Do you see? Yeah, I'm their chief. I have to go to funerals every weekend. You see? So then you ask yourself, what is this now? The man, but it's the same thing in West Africa. If you go to Ghana and Togo, it's like one town, Lomé, the capital of Togo, Lomé. Is it one town with a flower? The border runs in people's backyards. Somebody enters his house in the front from Togo, and he can come out in Ghana at the backyard. And the chief there, who I met many years ago, he says, yes, I have to cross the border with a passport. But he's the chief of both sides of the border. Now, this is the story of Africa, which we are trying to make real, and we are lying to our children and grandchildren that Botswana is different from South Africa. The Swazis are different from the Zulus. The Kangwane is different from the Siswati. You see? That the Lozi are different in Zambia from those in Botswana. That the Sutus are divided into these 3, 4, 5 different groups. When in fact, if you travel from, because the only thing which created the Sutu problem is that French people translated the Bible in Morija. And this side of the border was done by another missionary group. Mission is chasing after their constituencies. Now, this we are trying to sanctify. This is what we, the people who are leading our people, so-called educated people, this is what we are trying to make legitimate this is why I have departed considerably from my script. But let's see where I can go back, because there are a few facts which I want to bring to your attention with regards to South Africa's history with the international Pan-Africanist movement. I think I'll like to, the person who coined the term globally, Pan-African or Pan-African, was a West Indian, a Caribbean, from Uruka, Trinidad and Tobago, called Henry Sylvester Williams. Now, Henry Sylvester Williams in Britain in the late 1890s met, this was within a decade after the discovery of gold in the Rand. Henry Sylvester Williams met a South African woman and her husband called Kinloch, Anne Kinloch. The husband was a mining engineer in the Rand compounds. And the wife was revolted by what she saw in the mining compounds, what I call labor pens, where people were kept almost in prison and used as laborers, the mining compound. And she saw this and came to Britain and went round in the late 1890s, 1896, 97. This was 10 years after the discovery of gold. And speaking about it, now Henry Sylvester Williams had this talk, and he made contact with this family, the Kinloch family, and decided that they were going to make representations to the British government to do something about it, to do something about these atrocious conditions of people working in the mines. Now, 1897, he formed an association. Sylvester Williams formed an association, the African Association in Britain, to do this work, to advance this work. And then 3 years later, 1900, that is, he organized the Congress, which he called Pan-African Congress. Now, the term Pan-African was actually part of something global again. Pan-Hellenism for all Greeks, Pan-Germanism, Pan-Italianism or Italian, because Italian became Italian only in the 1860s. Pan-Slavism for all Slavs to come together. So Sylvester Williams also called Pan-African, coined the term, Pan-African, and had the first meeting, which was attended by all the luminaries, including a South African, I forget the name immediately, attended the meeting in London, Westminster Town Hall. That's how the first meeting was held. Du Bois, who made a big name out of Pan-Africanism, was in attendance, but he was not the originator of the idea. He was not, it was Henry Sylvester Williams. Now, interestingly, Sylvester Williams went on a tour then to the Caribbean and North America and came back to Britain again and went to join the Bar Association, became a lawyer, and immediately, within months after the Anglo-Boer War, the end of the Anglo-Boer, he was here in South Africa. He came to South Africa and worked in Cape Town as a lawyer. He was the first black lawyer called to the bar in Cape Town. So in his advocacy, he worked with people, including people like Jabavu, Tengu Jabavu, and Abdurrahman, so on. But he didn't last very long. 2 years later, he went back complaining about racism. He went back to Britain and got elected in municipal elections in Britain. Now, so you see, this is where the word originally comes from. But Sobukwe is the next man in the story. That Sobukwe lifted the word up again, but not before the work of people like Anton Lembede. Because the thinking, there's a strand, what you call the Africanist strand in anti-colonial thinking in South Africa. You could recognize it. It's reflected in other parts, you see it in other parts too, but in South Africa it's distinctly a strand from Pixley Seme. It misses Josiah Gumede a bit. Josiah Gumede in 1927, 26, 27, he was invited by the Communist International to Moscow, where he worked closely with Harry Haywood, the African-American communist, Harry Haywood. And Harry Haywood records that in a book called The Black Bolshevik, all the details, together with Laguma, James Laguma. They were part of the Communist International and in fact also part of the Imperialist League founded by Willy Munzenberg in that period. Anyway, the point is that the Pan-African idea, therefore, is as old as that, and it's closely linked with South Africa, even long before it was used anywhere else. And it was Henry Sylvester Williams who was driven to organize the first meeting on account of what they saw in the mining areas, just where we are, in fact, in South Africa, 100 and so many years ago. Now, so the OAU, which was achieved in 1963, was in fact a legitimation of the colonial partition. It was nothing more. And a lot of the debate which went on in the OAU before its foundation was, please listen to this, it was whether it should be a union of Africans or a union of the peoples of Africa. Do you get it? Make sure that you've got it right. Now, the debate was a furious debate. Well, there was the difference between the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. But the Casablanca group, because I remember that very well. I'm old enough to remember that very well when it happened. You know, the Casablanca group, the Monrovia group was American-backed. Well, American-backed not because the Americans sponsored it, but because the people were leaning heavily, Liberia, leaned very heavily on the United States, and they didn't want to do anything which America disagreed with. The Casablanca group then Morocco today is not like that. Morocco is very pro-American now. But at that time, Morocco was not. You know, and Casablanca group was the other group. But the more important thing about the debate between an organization of African states or African people and a unity of African people is that it was because the two principal people inhabiting the African continent are, it's not whites and blacks, please. It's Arabs and Africans. And it is not because of color again. Because in a place like Sudan, where I lived for some years teaching, you cannot tell the difference between an Arab and an African on the basis of color. All of them are black. And shades of black or shades of white, whichever way you want to call it. You see, it is a cultural difference. Cultural difference, because culture is the heart of identity. It is not color. It is culture. For heaven's sake, please let's remember this very carefully. It's time that we stopped harping on color. What we have to defend is our culture. And in that pillar called culture, it is language. It's the starting point. It's language. If we don't do anything about our language, we will disappear into history. We will become other people. We will become other people. We may look like we still look, but we will become other people. The people we imitate, the people whose language you take, the people whose religion we take, the people whose symbols we take, we adopt. We become them. Because Arabs, there are Arabs who are black, there are Arabs who are white. Jews, there are Jews who are black, there are Jews who are white. You see? The fact that most Africans are black is a blessing. You see? Because these other groups I'm talking about have culture, language, written languages which hold them together. Religion, underlying the biggest, the strongest holder of the Jewish identity, is a religion and para-religion, related religious features. Islam is a pivotal thing for Arabs, but it is not the main thing. It's not, there are Arabs who are Christians. But there's a certain respect for, and Arabs want Arab unity. But 2/3 of the Arabs in the world live on the African continent. There are more Arabs in Africa than anywhere else. They want Arab unity. They're struggling for Arab unity. They have heroes for Arab unity. And we want African unity. So somewhere along the line, we will have amicably to have some dividing line. Not for fighting, but so that we can protect our cultures and develop our cultures. It's understandable. Because they want, they call it El-Watan El-Arabi, the Arab nation. And the Arab nation for them starts in Morocco and ends in the Gulf. It's a legitimate claim because The British promised them, when the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, the Ottomans, remember the Turks were rulers in the Middle East. But when they were defeated in the First World War, part of the Central Powers, they were defeated, they divided the Arab world into what we have now through a treaty between the British and the French, again, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1917. Even before the war ended, they had decided that they were going to divide up and how to divide the place. So they gave places like Lebanon, Syria to the French, Palestine, they gave to the British mandate, the British, and Iraq, British, and so on. They divided the whole place up, you see. But the Arabs have always wanted unity, and they still want unity. Unfortunately, one of the people who Africans are not very clear about, Gaddafi, you know, who they killed, the Americans were responsible for his death. But at the same time, people think that Gaddafi is an African hero. Gaddafi was never an African. Gaddafi was an Arabist. He was an Arabist. He made no apologies for it. But when it suited him, you know, you would talk about Africanist purposes. But Gaddafi made a speech in Amman for the Arab League, the League of Arab States, that Africa, the continent of Africa, has space, and that the Arabs should move into Africa because that's the only space for expansion that they have. That was Gaddafi. And it's true. The Arabs first entered Africa, 642 AD. You remember, 10 years before the 632, the Prophet Muhammad died. Within a year, they conquered they united the whole of the Arab world. And in 10 years, they conquered from the Arabian Gulf, from Persia, in fact, from Persia, Iran now, all the way to Morocco. They conquered, the Caliphate conquered these parts. That was how quickly they were able. Now, 639, a general called Amr al-As crossed into Africa through Egypt. 642 AD, he built the first mosque in Cairo. I have been to the mosque. I've seen it in Cairo. Within 10 years, they were conquering the Nubian kingdoms of the Nile Valley, Makuria kingdoms. These kingdoms were, in fact, Christian at that stage, because that was the part which Emperor Theodosius had sent missionaries, the beginning of Christian expansion in the world. So, the Arabs managed to get to Morocco and went into Spain, where they created Andalusia. But after hundreds of years, they were kicked down, and they came south in the 12th century AD. They had Arabized the Berbers, the people of North Africa, the Moors, as they call them. And they used the Arabized Berbers, who were Africans. They now look light, but they're Africans. They're Aboriginal peoples of North Africa. They have an African language, you know, but they are now a minority, you know. And they used them to come southwards, conquering. That's how they defeated the Ghana Empire in 1076. 1076 AD, they conquered the Ghana Empire. And then to the Songhai and the Mali empires. followed. So you can see that there has been a process, historical process, of colonization and expansion of Arabic civilization, Arabic culture, because Arabic culture is one of the beautiful cultures of the world, one of the most brilliant cultures that has achieved power in the world. And so the whole of 1/3 of Africa now is Arabized. You see? 1/3 of Africa. So please, when we talk about African unity, we must wake up. Because the Arabs want Arab unity. There's an intellectual movement behind it where they're writing books about it. The British promised them unity in 1917, but they didn't give them the unity. They gave them Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq. See, the French took the other part, and now we look at what we have. People think that these states have been there forever. No. They were all one part. They were all a colonial empire of them. So the thing is that they want unity and we want unity. Now, but they have taken 1/3 of Africa in the process. And they have changed some of our people to become Arabs culturally, because it has nothing to do with color. I've told you. You see. So please, if we want to celebrate Sobukwe, we must realize these things. That the next installment, Lembede and them, they were African nationalists. Lembede and them who formed Jordan and Ashby Mda. Mda was the spark amongst them, amongst the three. Jordan, Gubani, and Ashby Mda, and Anton Lembede. But alas, Lembede died 2 years later. Suddenly, he was ill and he died. But these were hard African nationalists. And it's not by chance that he emerged in the late 40s, middle to 80s, because this was towards the close of the Second World War. And the Second World War, the rise of the Second World War, led to the loosening of imperial control all over the world. The Second World War led to independence processes throughout the world. In 1943, Lebanon became free. Syria, around 46, became free. India became free, 47. Pakistan, 47. Ceylon, 48. 1950, the Koreans battled with the United States for the peninsula. It was divided. Between 45 and 54, the Vietnamese were fighting. First, the Japanese were kicked out in 45. The French tried to come back and establish colonial power. They were fought. And again, I remember the last stages of that war, because it was reported every morning on the radio. In 1954, they defeated the French in a major battle called Dien Bien Phu, in a place called Dien Bien Phu. The younger ones here would not know the name, but Dien Bien Phu. I remember my father used to joke with my mother. He used to call her Dien Bien Phu. It was a joke at the time. Well, for him, he was very happy about the fact that it had happened, that they defeated the French, and the French, pictures of the French marching out with their hands up, and the Asians with guns. train on the French. Now, psychologically, you must understand what happens then. That suddenly, the people who had been sitting on you and kicking you, suddenly, they are your prisoners. The change, the psychological change, which must have taken place in the mind of the Indo-Chinese people, the Vietnamese people. They defeated France in war. Yeah. The French used Africans to fight there, and Arabs. They sent them to Vietnam to fight, but they defeated them. And so that was the end of it. Now, in Indonesia, from 1945, the Japanese went out. They were kicked out. But from 47, 48, there was civil war against the French, against the Dutch. And the Dutch were finally defeated. In Malaysia, from 1948 to 1960, there was also war. Malaysia, before Malaysia became independent. So you see, it's not by accident that 1944 saw the ANC Youth League emerge. If you see it in global terms, it all fits together. People demanding freedom, more democracy. The land is ours. We must have it back. And it's a legitimate call. That call, which finally in our times has narrowed down in South Africa to the land question. That is the heart of the economic dominance of settler colonialism. To break the back of settler colonialism is not a politics. You must break the economic back of settler colonialism. And that is the land alienation. Not by taking the land and looking for anybody black and giving it to him, but having an agrarian reform program which increases productivity and expands the capacity of a society to produce more wealth so that it can do other things too in the society. It can create new classes with property and so on to advance the national democratic revolution, the bourgeois democratic revolution. So I'm drifting again and again. And I didn't read the paper at all to you because of my talkativeness. But I'm sure I'll make the paper to you at some stage. So basically, you see, what we have to do for unity, African unity, is realize all of this. First, we must realize that we must share the continent with the Arabs. They are now part of us in the sense that they live on this continent with us. But culturally, they are not part of us. Culturally, and you see, they have an ugly history with us too. Slavery, persistent dehumanization of Africans has gone on uninterruptedly till the present time. Till the present time. I used to work in the Sudan, in the university, and they used to catch Dinka women and people and enslave them. I'm not talking about long ago. Things which are happening even as we speak. You see, they used to say, Abid yektul abid, killing a slave with a slave. Because in the insurgencies against African groups, they would take Africans from the north and use them as soldiers to go and fight in the south. The emergence of South Sudan as a state is a triumph of African nationalism. It's halted the southward march of Arabism, which has gone on uninterruptedly for hundreds of years. Suddenly there was a state. Because even in the north of Sudan, the majority of the people are African cultured. But it's a small group of Africans who are Arabized. Some of my colleagues in the university who were from the north, Nubians, told me, Professor Farouk Kaduda, for example, he told me, Kwesi, my language is Nubian, Mahas. It's the same languages spoken in the Upper Egypt, in Aswan. He says, but I'm not allowed to speak the language at school. And we were not allowed to speak it at school. Our language, Nubian language, could not speak it at school. You could only speak it in the house with your mother and father. And your mother and father stopped speaking it because there's no economic benefit to knowing it. So it's eroded steadily. These are the people who have become so Arabized now that they are even more virulently Arab than they are. And these are people, African people with African languages. You see? But slowly the languages have been eroded. And you have a situation where they stand up for Arabism. We have to share the continent and peacefully with the Arabs. But we must protect ourselves so that our cultures can also have space and room to flower. Because without that, we can't go to space. We can't build ships. And until we can build ships and penicillin and rocketry in our languages, we are not going to be able to compete with anybody in the world. And people will look down on us forever. But the day, like the Chinese have done, can do everything in Mandarin. And remember that the Chinese language that they're using now so well, scientifically, it was only done in the 1920s. It was Mao Zedong and his friends who elevated the street-level Chinese, Pinyin, into education. Anybody who advances on the basis. Shakespeare and them, before Shakespeare and Marlowe, the language of scholars and educated people was Latin. If you study to a high level, then you will be using Latin and speaking Latin in Latin. You see? But they changed it. When they change it, they bring it to a broader class. And that lifts the society up because it empowers them with knowledge and ability to access knowledge. And it lifts the whole society up because knowledge comes to a broader section of the population. That way, they did it. So that's one thing we must remember. The second thing is that we have to have ways of freeing labor and capital to make movement of both labor and capital. Fortunately, in South Africa, it's not a problem because the whole history of gold mining is migrant labor. Up to now, you go to Lesotho, the 2/3 of the money revenue that they get out of migrants who come here and they export the money there. But we must free labor and capital. Free labor and capital. Free them in the sense that we must create more scope for labor to move a little more freely. Capital also has to move more freely. In Africa, with our own currency. But capital has to move. We must have a situation in which Patrice Motsepe can work with Dangote, the richest African on earth, that they can team up. They have the possibility of teaming up and starting giant companies across the continent, tech companies, new technologies, just like the Chinese have done. And remember, the Chinese case is led by a Chinese Communist Party. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is supervising the most rapid, advanced capitalist development in our times. TikTok and Alibaba, and they are all done under the auspices. People say, but how can communists allow that to go on? Because they understand that capitalism as a global system is not finished yet. You can't go and throttle it like squeezing a life out of it. No. It has historically, just like I said earlier on, slave systems gave way to these, and they are uneven. One society will move faster with it, but at the same time, they're all influencing each other. We in Africa have not seen capitalism in a serious sense. It hasn't happened yet. We need more Dangotes. We need more Matsepes. We need more Cyril Ramaphosa's. But not as president, as moneyed people. You can't do both. You must do one or the other. And you want to mix them up. You see, but we need that sort of thing. We need that growth, that powerful growth, and we need to loosen. We need to make it possible for Chief Linswe to move across the border without trouble. The late Chief Linswe. I mean that, and we need to allow our cultures. We need to share the books. When I was director of CASAS, we produced the first monolingual dictionary for Siswati. When we took it to Swaziland, the first monolingual dictionary in Siswati, it was led by somebody you know, Otlogetswe, Tapelo Otlogetswe, from the University of Botswana. He was a lexicographer who supervised the work. They wouldn't allow us to use the dictionary in schools there, they said. I said, why? They said, because Macmillan's publishers has monopoly. All school books in Swaziland have to be produced by Macmillan's publishers. So they bought the rights from CASAS to change it and publish it. Now, that sort of thing is criminal. For any leader to allow that sort of thing to go on and to talk about decoloniality and academics preaching neo-colonialism, making analysis, and right under their noses, this sort of thing going on. We have to stop. We have to stop this. Half the time, the problem I find with technological, I call it technological fecundity. That is the profusion and the creation of terms which are like people are playing with them. Is that because we do these in languages which are not our own, we tend to lose track of what we are doing. Some of the terms we use for decoloniality and so on, they have nothing really serious to describe African societies about. So the thing is that we must open. It should be possible to have a university using Nguni, where anybody from the Nguni cultural area can go to that university. Tswana should be able, it should be possible even to have one university with those two possibilities. That's just a technical. But basically, we must do something concrete, something. The Irish, I was talking to people yesterday about it. People forget that the Irish in England, in the British Isles, the Irish people, their language was suppressed by the English. People don't know this. But they butchered them. The English killed them. Over centuries, they were butchering them. They took their land, butchered them. And they rose up several times. They tried to rise up. 1916, there was a big movement which led to what they call the Easter Rising. And they fought, but they lost. But they fought so hard that the British had to make concessions to give them what they call home rule, partial political independence. The first thing they did was to resuscitate their language. The Irish, they brought their language back. They are the finest writers of the English language. You know, they are writers, people like Yeats. The finest, the best users of the English language. And yet, they took their own language back and started developing it. And now they are using it, using their language. Everybody does that. Anybody who has any pride, sense, will do that. Only colonized people do not see it. People like us do not see, do not realize it. So, listen, I think I have gone on a bit too long. So, and I have not read my paper at all. But this is one of the crazy things I do sometimes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Professor Pra. That was great, very powerful. It was history, the whole history session, unfiltered, unmediated, not tidied up or neatly packaged as we read history, but just flowing naturally from the source of wisdom, source of experience. Thank you very much, Professor. I hear there's a poem coming up. Thank you. Just been given the name. That's Mark Manaka. Mark Manaka. As we know, you won't find all of these things in the program. This is Africa. Yeah. If you're looking for his name here, you won't find it. Poets are inspired. They just moved by spirit and they never really inserted into programs. So where is Mark Manaka? I hope he's ready. Nazo.
major change. Yes, we know the past left our hearts rotting in that ditch. Yes, we know Arqan. But I refuse to choose between compromise and mental bondage, especially in this time of self-rage. I pray to be the best among shadows that linger in the darkest corners of my forest, because lately, my Africa, it has become too black, too be white for you and me to see. Though sunshine can sometimes recite music through poetry, and I am the musician with no visa petition, and so my image was denied. So back to the future I trot, in search of honesty and sincerity, because nowadays our days are enslaved by thought. But how do I carry darkness back to my house, Makala Kumbozi? How do I carry darkness back to my house? Because home is love and light. And so in the present, Africa, in the present I must remain. Cleanse our cause from this normal insanity. The future will have to take another shot of Amstel and Mainstay, because our identity is gone. Our identities are forged on the sidewalk of Richmond Station. It's now slavery for entertainment, and so we walk, carrying empathy in our wallets, ignorance in our content, and nameless contacts engraved on walls that forgot who was here first. Khoisan, it's your time. Make them remember. Bekra, it's your time. Make them remember. Mbondo, it's your time. Make them remember. Basaro, Wahuruti, Wagoni, it's your time. Make them remember. Together we'll make them remember the dismembered. Because your art of survival is slowly fading behind the president's mask. In the dark it was written, Africa. In the dark it was written, and through light it must be spoken. And through light it must be spoken that we fight for the right to call our souls, my sister, our own. We fight for the right to call this land our own. Where is the Khalakhan in our parliament? And not the coat of arms with that stolen arms code, but the sand of defiance that used to live on Moses' feet. Where is that rhythm of change? Where is that rhythm of change in Sobuka's heartbeat? But I, as a poor youth, questions, where are the statues of our forgotten heroes in the dingy corners of our ghettos? Whose heritage is this? Am I forced to be fond of? From Dingan's Day to Heritage Day to Pride Day. I mean, what do you expect me to do, my Africa? Pride my heritage away? It's not you know. And out of all this rubbish, a voice of reason shouts, we need our own to look up to. We need our own to look up to, because sons and daughters of the so-called revolution are dying of cricket expectation. See them bleed of desperation. In the dark it was written, and through light it must be spoken, that our liberation was born out of fear. For how long will the struggle continue to compromise while freedom whispers false light in my ear? Believe me when I tell you, Africa, poverty and AIDS will be some child's Christmas gift again this year. In the dark it was written, and through light it must be spoken. Our fight is the right to call our souls our own. We fight to call what is ours our own. The humble, presentable president dies for Papa One. The holy, presentable Pope signs the church to papers that carry liars. Why should people believe? Why should the human heart feed off corruption? Listen to the white elephant crying to me, and you singing Chimureka and the blues in search of food and anything. You know, Marichera was right. When this kind of freedom comes, any alcohol will do. Man walks out on his family for another man. Mother murders her feelings trying to understand, and their children bury their anger with beach sand. Durban can be depressing in summer, but how crooked was the hand that wrote you that love letter, my sister. But I, as a sinner, will tell you, how can
Greetings to the house. Lebitso la ka ke Lehasa Moloi. So somehow I was supposed to come and introduce the poet. So as I was supposed to do that, I also had to pick him from the door. Ntate ke Makamele Armanaka, who is a Soweto-born poet with a strong artistic heritage. South African icon Ntate Don Matera says, if genius can be genetically corrected, and if it flows from generation to generation, then Magmanaka is the epitome of it. He comes from the dynasty of the talented, creative, and gifted people Nomsa and Mutsemela. Mag, as he is widely known, has published 4 collections of poetry, if only self-published, in 2003, edited by Don Matera. One is In Time, and it was published in 2009, and the other is Flowers of the Broken Smile, published in 2016, and Oncoming Traffic, and also Word Sound. Some of his poems have been in the journals, newspapers, such as Mail and Guardian. So in few words, Manaka's energetic poetry has seen him travel the globe from Soweto to Spain, Cuba, Jamaica, Lesotho, Botswana, Germany, Holland, Italy, Switzerland. He performed at the inauguration of the former president, Mr. Thabo Mbeki, and was invited to perform for the late Mr. Nelson Mandela, the former president. And he is the Demaya Chrysler Poet of the Year 2005 award and nominee. He represented South Africa at the closing ceremony of the 2016 FIFA World Cup in Germany. Manaka runs a creative writing classes, and around South Africa, he holds the master's degree in creative writing from Rhodes University. Ke a leboga.
Thank you, Ntate Mloyi. Thank you so much. As you can see, we can only introduce a poet, Imbongi Yomthonyama, afterwards. Yeah. Okay, we are almost concluding this plenary session, but I'm told that the message of support from the Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe Trust is finally ready to be read by Omis Sandy again. We'll ask you, if you are ready, my sister, to come forward. Thank you.
When the spirit moves you, you move. Noma siyabhimba. Greetings again, my Africa. I'm reading this note on behalf of Professor Tobe Gamda, a trustee from the Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe Trust. It reads as follows. Greetings to all the Pan-Africanist admirers, supporters, and followers of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe and what he stood for. On behalf of the Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe Trust, thank you very much to Unisa, especially the Department of History, as well as the Department of Political Sciences, for organizing this conference. It is tempting to say that this conference is long overdue. However, saying so might suggest that I am pointing fingers and also suggests that so and so or such and such should have actually organized it. So rather, we are very grateful that on this year in which we commemorate the birth of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, 100 years ago, an event of this nature and stature is being held. We thank all the contributions to this conference that will shine the spotlight on the great intellectual giant and the sacrifices of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. I wish the conference a great success. I trust that the deliberations will capture and reflect Sobukwe's spirit. In conclusion, my wish and hope for you at the end of this conference is that, in Sobukwe's words, open quote, "Let me plead with you, lovers of Africa, to carry with you into the world a vision of an Africa renewed. Remember Africa," close quote. She says, "Izwe lethu, i-Africa. I-Africa? Ndiyabulela.
Siyabulela nathi sisi. Thank you to Professor Mda as well. I know she'll listen to the recording. We really appreciate the messages of support, and also to the one that was read earlier, Dr. Pegu. We really appreciate those messages of support. We've been sitting for a while. It's time to get up. I'm seeing nods. It's time to get up, yes, and move. We are at the end of the plenary session. We are going to break now. As we break, please feel free to grab some refreshments. They are available. And we are going to break into our breakaway rooms, where we will have the further discussions. We're going to move from here to the two exam halls, exam hall 1 and exam hall 2. If you're not familiar with the space, all you do is to walk down the hallway towards the end, towards the elevators. You go down one flight of stairs and you will find the exam halls there. They are marked, clearly marked, exam hall and exam hall 1 and exam hall 2. Before we leave this place, I would just like to acknowledge two veterans that you might meet on the way and not know who they are. They are going to be our keynote speakers in the next 2 days. And the first is Professor Dove. Professor Dove, who's joined us all the way from Temple University in Philadelphia, USA. There she is, sitting over there. Veteran emeritus professor. And another veteran emeritus professor among us is Professor Ramose. Where is Professor Ramose? Where is he? Oh, there he is. Yeah. Oh, well, he's known to some of us, those who've been with Unisa for many, many years, not me, of course. He's founding director of the Unisa Regional Learning Center at Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He's also the former chair of Department of Political Science and Philosophy when they were still combined. He's the former chair of those departments, of that department. That's Professor Ramose. Without further ado, thank you very much for being such a kind audience. My job ends here. Please, if you need assistance moving from here to the exam halls, let us know. Oh, there's an announcement. Yes. Thank you very much, Sandy, for that quick announcement. And I was saying, as we move, please make sure you take your belongings with you, not because there are any thieves at Unisa, but just in case you forget where you left your stuff, just in case. Just take your belongings with you. I will read a quote before we leave. And the quote is right at the bottom of your program. It reads as follows: "You have seen by now what education means to us. The identification of ourselves with the masses. Education to us means service to Africa. In whatever branch of learning you are there for Africa." Robert Sobukwe. Please ruminate on this and any other anything else that was said here in this plenary session as we go on. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Molweni, welcome to the afternoon session of this wonderful memorial and set of discussions. The theme we're going to be engaging this afternoon, colleagues, is titled Pan-Africanism, Peace and Security in Africa. It's very broad, but hopefully very stimulating. We have had a few departures, and therefore we'll have to depart from the schedule. Samkelo Ngadi has politely asked to be excluded from the program, and in his place we have put Ubongani Mavundla, who, colleagues, I'll introduce to you shortly. Secondly, we'll have Alisa Adams, who will then present after. But then the final participant or discussant, and Professor Ernest Zelamuni, is not present, so we'll just sort of hopefully engage in a bit of discussion, Q&A afterwards. Colleagues, without further delay, let me introduce you to, or at least have Bongani Mavundla take the floor and introduce his topic and discuss it as well. Please warmly welcome our young colleague.
Okay. Yes, please. Good afternoon, everyone. Please be kind to me. I was co-opted this morning to this thing. So, but nonetheless, the title of the presentation is Theorizing Sobukwe Through Conceptual Poems, a sociological poetic inquiry of Sobukwe's speeches. I'm sure we've all become aware that in the past decade or so, there has been some mainstream rediscovery or re-recognition some way, somehow, although it's still in the sort of the margins of the mainstream of Sobukwe's political leadership. But when you often think about how we think about Sobukwe, the scholarship on Sobukwe as an intellectual in his own right is still quite lacking at the current moment in which we find ourselves in. A lot of scholars often focus on Sobukwe as this, for his moral leadership, how he was able to sacrifice, to serve, and also the kinds of works that you see out there is that they tend to speak of Sobukwe as something that the current political estate lacks. And this is not wrong, And some of the works tend to be quite biographical. However, the available writings of Sobukwe have received very little scholarly attention as a corpus of social thought capable of being mined for the development of social theories, on various areas in relation to nationalism, oppression, resistance, and any latent ideas that allow for the extending or rethinking of Sobukwe's idea. And I must say that it is very difficult for one to try and do this with someone like Sobukwe, because in the Pan-Africanist circles, he often tends to be a person that's so highly contested, There are so many Sobukwes out there. Well, but I'm sure there's one that some of us tend to think that is the most accurate one, but there are so many Sobukwes out there that the kind of scholarship around the ideas of Sobukwe has not really taken progress. It has not really grown, despite what a lot of people often say about it. So as a response to this identified gap, I employ the method of poetic inquiry, which is a qualitative method of data reduction against the speeches of Robert Sobukwe for conceptual formulation. Largely, it meant that I went through most of these speeches and identified the underlying themes within those speeches And after doing that, I sought to try and look what these concepts are saying to each other within these speeches of Sobukwe. So in other words, my approach utilizes the poetic as a basis for insights, because thinking through metaphors and aesthetics can be helpful for sociological analysis. And I believe that this is also quite important, largely because that in as much as we've sort of recognized the absence of African ideas within fields such as, or subdisciplines such as social theory or political theory, but the kind of systematizing of these people's work has not yet started. The tendency is for people to announce the call that we must decolonize, but we hardly see people engaging these works for the purposes of extrapolating the lessons that we can learn from these people. So as a methodology, poetic inquiry employs poetry as an alternative means for interpreting, communicating, and improving an understanding of social experiences and meaning. The method basically combines basic assumptions of qualitative research with poetry as a form of art to creatively express experience. But moreover, I use this method for the purposes of data reduction. You know, if you are going through a large set of information, you have to find a way of reducing that information so that you are able to make sense of it throughout the different speeches that are there, so that you're also able to identify the cross-cutting issues across all those different writings. So as a data source, I think that some people don't see this as quite important. For now, I decided to use the compilation by Sinetemba Majoli, which was taken out on 2012. And the reason largely for that is the speeches of Sobukwe tended to be edited in certain instances. For example, when you look at the series of speeches that the PAC Secretariat of Information was taking out from 65, critiques of people like Chairman Mao have been edited out in those versions of the speeches. Some people say that it's because Sobukwe's views were informed Sobukwe was misled by the prejudices of South African media. But one person who's also willing to think deep enough will also start to understand that it was also at the time when the PAC had started to form relations with the People's Republic of China. So they did not want to be seen as criticizing an ally of theirs. And I really would like to encourage people, more especially the historians, to sort of follow on these type of editings that happen across these speeches. More especially, a very good area that we could explore is the changing of the PAC's positions, particularly after the closure of the Bureau of African Affairs, which was in Ghana, which in most cases used to take the responsibility of funding the liberation movement. The ousting of Nkrumah really created a lot of problems for a lot of organizations. So in this process, what I did then is that I created what we call research poems. To do this, it required that I immerse myself in the readings and reviewing all different speeches of Sobukwe and establishing common themes across all of them, which is a common process of what we call thematic analysis. The final themes, of course, were reconfigured. What I was eventually left with was the concept of radical affirmation that you find in the works of Sobukwe, what I call recombinant mobilization against paternalism and self-assertion. I will only present two parts. So just to show you a product of what is done, what has happened is that this theme that speaks about self-assertion, it goes something like this. And I made sure to use Sobukwe's words so that I try to keep as much to his spirit. But he says, sons and daughters of the soil, Habingas of the new world, we want to build a new Africa, only we can build it. The step we are taking is pregnant with historical possibilities. Appreciate our role, appreciate our responsibility. It is a struggle between Africa and Europe, between the 20th century desire for self-realization and a feudal conception of authority. Let it be clear that we are not just fighting apartheid. We are fighting the whole concept of white supremacy. We are fighting the noblest cause on earth, the liberation of mankind. It is a battle for the reconquest for the continent of Africa, which for over 300 years has been the prostitute of philanderers and rakes of Western capitalism. Our fight is against the political, economic, social status of the African. It must be clearly understood that we are not begging the foreign minorities to treat our people courteously. We are not hoping for a change of heart on the part of the Christian oppressor. We are calling on our people to assert their personality. We represent the fresh fragrances of flowers in bloom. We represent progress. We will not retreat. We will not compromise. We will not relent. And as you can see, those artistic licenses that I've used, I've put the terms in brackets, but it was largely for the purposes of ensuring that what is written still keeps the essence. So how does one then turn such a poem into some sort of a theory? I then generate a model which I call the dialectics of self-assertion, because in Sobuko's speech you see an interplay of three different factors that he speaks about. It's a collective agency. Sorry, one, okay. It is time, and its moralities, and its positionalities. I'd just like to, I won't really get into the interpretation of that right now, but let me say the collective agency, Sobuko is really calling people out for resistance, but in his speaking, he also mobilizes finds ways of mobilizing both the present and the future. So you find that Sobuko is politicizing even things that we may not consider to be as political, like politicizing time. He's also politicizing moralities by showing people that we are not necessarily appealing. We are not necessarily appealing to be accepted, or we understand that our liberation will not come from people changing their hearts. Positionalities, of course, which is the point of departure of all struggles. We want to change people's positions. And in this case, Sobuko speaks about this in the way of political status, social status, and economic status. So just the second one, against paternalism. And with this particular poem, what you get to see is that in the engagement with Sobuko's work is that the criticism is often leveled at that Sobuko was quite critical of the Indian elite. He was quite critical of the white liberal elite. But as I actually went through these speeches, Sobuko was also quite equally critical of the African elite, whom he often saw as wanting to be assimilated and not necessarily interested in the total overthrow of white domination. So against paternalism goes like this. Every time our people have shown signs of uniting against our oppression, their friends have come along and broken that unity. In the very earliest day, it was the missionary. Between 1946, the professional liberal. They call themselves our guardians, our trustees. They see us as a child nation, composed of boys and girls, ranging in age from 120 years to 1 day. We also see the intellectual converts to our cause, those who benefit materially from the present setup, so they cannot completely identify themselves with our cause. They demand checks and balances. They stultify and retard the movement of Africans. Consciously or unconsciously, they protect their sectional interests. This time we will not be bamboozled. The merchant class, tainted with the virus of cultural supremacy, national arrogance, identifies itself with the oppressor. Their politics are those of preservation and sectional interests. This time we will not be bamboozled. We do not wish to use anybody, nor do we intend to be used by anybody. The African people will win their own liberation. They will rely on themselves relentlessly instead of relying on the sympathetic. This time we will not be bamboozled. I think I inserted this poem correctly here. But here, this is where he particularly puts the critique against the African political leadership. It says, the responsible moderate leaders you see handle us. The result has been that these quarters, which fear the militancy of the African people more than they loathe oppression, and are hoping and praying that the boycott will fizzle out before they are compelled to call it off. In particular, Sobukwe was speaking in response to two events at that time. It was the protest of women against alcohol bannings in the Durban, and what was also called the potato boycotts. His argument was that even though the leadership was there, but the leadership was largely there to quell the frustrations of the people. And outside of all these themes, what one does is then that I am able to generate some form of conceptual model that shows what Sobukwe is saying about all these kinds of different leaders. In essence, he shows that their actions, whether consciously or subconsciously, they end up reinforcing white domination. But as a contradiction of the struggle, we find them as elites that are participating. But in their participation, often they're interested in preserving their supremacy, their sectional interests. And in Sobukwe's, the way he speaks, we're even able to see what role each and every one of these leaders actually does. Trusteeship and interiorization, because elites are often tend to be like that. There's division of the oppressed, and there's managing frustrations. And I must say that when we speak about the oppressed, these people whom these things are often done to. Sobukwe in his speeches, and unfortunately I could not deliberate on that here, but Sobukwe has always said that the core and center of our struggle is the semi-literate and illiterate masses. He's merely referring to the poor and the exploited. Those are the core and center of the struggle. And the relationship of every one of these kinds of elites in relation to this core of the struggle has always been one in which these leaders are often doing things to serve their own interests and preserving their own supremacy. Last slide. So I hoped that by doing this, I would do two things, basically. Visualize and give voice to Sobukwe, which is something that hardly happens. But more importantly, also to try and start that scholarly conversation in terms of how could we employ different methodological innovations so that we start that work of systematically theorizing the work of our African leaders. Thank you, colleagues. Sure. Thanks. Sure.
Another hearty or a round of applause for our brother Mahmoud. Part of my task is to connect that wonderful interpretation of Mangolusu Sobukwe's thought. Interpretation, I think, is the theme for this conference as well, and how we understand the life and work of this great warrior. And the theme for this, the sub-theme for this particular discussion is Pan-Africanism, peace and security in Africa. It's important for us to contextualize our reality now and the work that he did to help people understand the nature of struggle. And what our esteemed colleague has just done is just that. He's brought us closer to understanding what Mangaliso Sobukwe was trying to share with his comrades. Thank you for that presentation. Colleagues, let me, without delay, welcome our second speaker, Alisa Adams. The floor is yours.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Yes. Great. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to extend my warm greetings to each and every one of you, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues. Today, we convene to delve into the intricate nexus of Pan-Africanism, peace, and security in Africa. Your presence here underscores the significance of this discourse, and I'm truly honored to stand before you as we embark on this intellectual journey together. I am Elisa Adams, hailing from the vibrant city of Harare, Zimbabwe, and my upbringing in Zimbabwe instilled in me a profound fascination with African development and the rich tapestry of Pan-African thought. Thus, I embarked on a scholarly pursuit in political science at the master's level, with a specialization in political justice and legitimacy, steeped in the realms of political philosophy. However, in the course of my academic journey, I encountered a discernible problem within the scholarly landscape: the absence of robust African political philosophy. As I delved deeper into Western political philosophy, it became increasingly apparent that a distinctively African political philosophy is imperative for us to advance, is imperative for the advancement of African nations. Hence the motivation for the essay that I'll be speaking to you on today. The title of that essay is Freedom Denied: Unraveling the Paradox of Zimbabwe's Post-Independence Struggle for Liberty, which scrutinizes Zimbabwe's quest for authentic freedom post-independence, resonating with the broader struggles across the African continent. At its core, my article posits that African nations grapple with the attainment of genuine freedom due to their reliance on dominant Western political philosophies, rather than grounding our understandings of freedom within the unique African context and historical background. To support this argument, I draw upon the insights of eminent Pan-African thinkers such as Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, Tete Kofi, and Robert Sobukwe himself, who advocate for the necessity of Pan-African ideologies. However, the assimilation of these Pan-African ideologies face resistance, particularly amongst those entrenched in Western political thought. To overcome this, I start by meticulously deconstructing the prominent Western conceptions of liberty, which are negative liberty, positive liberty, and Republican liberty. I elucidate the inadequacy within an African framework. In the article, I explain each conception of liberty based on the most influential scholars that have advocated for each conception. When you look at these concepts, it's clear why many people assumed that absolute freedom was achieved in Africa post-colonization. However, after conducting various interviews with residents of Zimbabwe, I conducted 7 interviews of people in various backgrounds and genders. It became very clear that nobody in Zimbabwe currently feels free, and that can be extended to other African nations as well. So I took it upon myself to investigate why this was the case. Despite fulfilling the criteria of all these conceptions, Zimbabweans do not feel free. As such, I go on to explore the arguments that have been posited by Pan-African scholars regarding the notion of freedom. Many of these prominent authors argue that the struggle for freedom as a notion is remnant of the struggle for an African identity that existed since colonization. Hence why the above conceptualizations based on Western liberalism are still used in countries like Zimbabwe. However, we're building our societies on conceptions that do not work for us culturally. The 2 most prominent themes that stood out from the Pan-African writing was the need for a conception of freedom to account for Africa's strong communal beliefs and our unique view of economics within our countries. Any African conception of freedom needs to incorporate these 2 pillars of African identity. Central to this discourse is the realization that Western liberal ideologies are ill-suited to African contexts, given the inherently communal nature of African societies. Ubuntu, encapsulating the ethos of communal well-being, underscores that individual freedom is linked to the collective emancipation of the community, whereas the Western conceptions of freedom are more focused on individual freedom within one's society. Moreover, economic freedom emerges as a salient facet of freedom in African societies, emphasizing the imperative of communal economic security. The concept of African socialism, championed by scholars like Tete Kofi, advocates for an economic paradigm rooted in communal solidarity, diverging from the capitalist framework imposed upon African states. Coffey explains this ideology in great detail. African states are currently embroiled in the Western economic system, i.e. capitalism. However, African states have been and will continue to be subservient in this system. We are on the losing side of capitalism, and on top of this, African culture, as explained through Ubuntu, does not even identify with capitalism. Rather, we have identified with more socialist or communist principles, such as freedom from economic and social inequalities within our societies. Hence why scholars such as Dubois, Nkrumah, and Coffey have developed this idea of African socialism. Much like the USSR or China, Africa needs to also develop an economic system that works in our unique context. This system needs to be based on communal economic security and socialist principles so that all members of society feel free and economically secure within the community. In conclusion, my article underscores the imperative for transcending Eurocentric narratives and forging an authentic African ideology reflective of our cultural ethos. To truly emancipate ourselves, African nations must chart a collective path forward, fostering inclusive communities and equitable economic systems. In essence, the quest for freedom in Africa necessitates a paradigm shift, from the individualistic ethos of Western liberalism to communal vision that embodies the essence of Ubuntu and African socialism. Only through this transformative journey can we realize the aspirations of a truly liberated Africa. Thank you.
Once again, a hearty round of applause for our esteemed colleague. Well done. Thank you. Colleagues, before I open the floor for your hopefully engaging questions and debate on these topics, let me try and summarize what our speakers have tried to share with us. So, Bongani Mavundla, once again, excellent summary of what you worked on. And what I picked up from your piece was the challenge of interpreting Mangaliso Subuki's work, the challenge in understanding core tenets or thrusts of what he was trying to share. These being radical affirmation, collective agency, all up against the paternalism of a certain community. And this in your description was white supremacy. I think in terms of when we look at Pan-Africanism as a whole and its agenda to unify Africans, not just on the continent, but globally, these are core issues that we face in terms of securing a peace that we want to achieve for ourselves and for humanity. So that was appreciated that you brought that up in that manner. And that is my way of tying his conversation to this theme. Thank you. With Lisa Adams, and I thank you for coming across this neo-colonial border to express a sentiment that our ancestors have done in the way you have is exemplary. Political justice and the legitimacy or lack thereof of a political philosophy. It is a topic that has been dealt with quite a lot, but the way you summarized it was laudable. I appreciate the fact that you highlighted how when we conceive of liberty, we need to ground it in Africanist cultures, in Africanist themes. That was very important. That Western liberal philosophies had a place in human society and how we understand human beings, but at some point become incompatible with Pan-Africanist notions of liberty, unity, emancipation. And thirdly, that when we look at the Pan-Africanist struggle, the foundation of the struggle is economic. And again, you touched on that theme, and that was excellent. Colleagues, what I'm trying to say is our discussants were on point for what they were trying to show us today in the work of Umangaliso Sobukwe, and how relevant it is for our struggle today to ensure a so-called peaceful and secure African world, if not human world. It is on that ground that I think I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers. My eyesight is bad. Let me directed at any of the discussants. I'll start from back to front as opposed to front to back. So right at the back, I see a gentleman over there, second row from the end. Is your mic?
Yes, I hope
Wonderful.
I'm audible.
And sorry, before you begin, please introduce yourself in terms of your name, your clan.
Okay. Lahasa Moloi. And I work in this institution, Department of Development Studies. And I appreciate the two speakers who have led us into reflections. At the back of my mind, as I listened to the first speaker, he meticulously expresses the active African agency of Sobukwe, whose vision transcends, shallow analysis of what white supremacy is. Whether at his time, his reading and seeing of what white supremacy is and how it functions, whether he was understood at that time, which are the issues we are seeking to deal with, which some of the scholars called decolonial scholars speak about the straitjacket of the colonial matrices of power. So at the back of my mind, I feel like before the manifestation of these colonial empires with the lines of division as we have seen during the Berlin Conference, I keep thinking about the empire of the mind that then is manifested into practice. Think about Hegel when he was giving the lectures on Africa, setting the tone by insulting. They have no history, they have no culture, they are subhuman beasts, along with the entourage of your David Hume and all of that. So I'm thinking about this wall of breaking the system from the mind, so that the physical cages which they have constructed, they can be able to break. So it's not so much of a question, maybe a comment. We sometimes can be trapped in a thinking that Professor Pra in the morning was showing us that we have no state. We are byproducts of sacrificial violence born through the brutality of colonial rape. But somewhere, somehow, we seem to be having a hope that these are African states. But even the economics that we may see.
Okay. I just want to request that you summarize your comment, or at least.
So I'll just simply say, maybe in brief, the crisis of functioning from dislocated concept systems and institutions, which we may think are a hope to redeem the African spirit continues to be the same system that entraps us into their model. So I find that sometimes to be problematic even when we deal with the economics. Thank you.
Yes, much appreciated, Prof. Malloy. I see another hand at the back. No, then it's you, Prof. Sesanti. Yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Chair, I'd just like to comment on both presentations, beginning with the last from our Sister Adams there. Thank you very much for contextualizing this and bringing the Afrocentric perspective into it. I just want to bring to your attention very quickly that, Kwame Nkrumah in his autobiography speaks about African socialism, right? And that this was raised at the 1945 Pan-African Congress, right? Congress. But in his later works, Kwame Nkrumah strongly rejected African socialism. He dismissed it completely from a scientific socialist perspective. And he clearly identified himself as a Marxist-Leninist. And of course, for the record, I want to align myself with your position that I stood next to Julius Nyerere, who until the end fully and well articulated the meaning of the concept of African socialism. And linking it back then with our brother Mavundla then, within the circles of the Pan-Africanist Congress, when it came to the question of socialism, in the piece it was said it would be an Africanist socialist and democratic order. There is no mention there of scientific socialism. It is the disciples of Mangaliso Sobukwe who then smuggle this in and speak about the Marxist, Maoist, and all of that. You're correct. And I let me rather not think that I understood what you were saying, but let me say that if I understood you correctly, that whilst those who claim to follow Mangaliso Sobukwe make a lot of noise about external forces silencing Sobukwe, actually those who have silenced Sobukwe are those within the Pan-Africanist Congress. And I'm not alone in this. I think Ali Shongwane makes this point in his introduction to Ali Shongwane's, it's Bakeng, I think, makes a point in Ali Shongwane's introduction to John Yatipokela, John Yatipokela, where he makes the point that within the Pan-Africanist Congress, there was little or nothing said about Pan-Africanism. That which is supposed to be the core ideology of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And there was more that was said about Marxism, Leninism, Maoism included. Meaning, therefore, that those who claim to be following Sobukwe have, in fact, been the ones who have prostituted themselves. And I'm raising on this point because it is important that we must speak the truth before we die, in the language that Mangaliso Sobukwe, has stated. And lastly, program director, you're quite correct, and I'm sure on this point I understood. When you were saying that Sobukwe did not only object to the elitism of others, he also understood it within. And it is for that reason that even as a student, Mangaliso Sobukwe, when he arrived as a first-year student, said that he was snobbish upon the others to begin to treat those who were just arriving in a particular manner, and he was silenced. Africans were the very first ones who silenced Mangaliso Sobukwe before they went into it.
Thank you very much for that provocative comment or series of comments. Colleagues, more questions or short comments?
It's a point of...
Just
a point of assistance.
Yeah.
Because there are colleagues online, if colleagues mute, they cannot hear. So
Sure.
just procedurally, we should also allow them to hear. In case the mic gets muted, we need to...
Perfectly understood. I hope the general's comments have been noted. Thank you, Bob. As we move forward, let's get the question from Mr. Mantash, correct?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I wanted to make a few comments, and maybe the panel can comment on them, and I'll try to be as short as possible. Thank you. The professor raises issues that I wanted to contend with, and maybe it would be nice to hear what the panelists think. I agree that Nkrumah did abandon the notion of African socialism and embraced scientific socialism, but I'm not quite sure that it should be true that he at the same time abandoned Pan-Africanism. Quite frankly, Nkrumah spoke to the reason he revisited, as I understand, African socialism was to focus on the economic question and not to divert from the notion of African nationalism, which was the backbone of the thought process of Africanists across the globe. So I wanted to hear, because I wanted Ms. Adams to speak to how do we reconcile Nkrumah, the later Nkrumah, with the earlier one, given that one would think that one's thought advanced. To Prof. Sasante, then the thoughts are regressing. And so Nkrumah is not getting better. Secondly, I wanted to probe a question about this notion. It appears that our discussion is that capitalism is a European invention. And if you look at the Pan-Africanist Manifesto, the very first section of that manifesto talks to what it calls chain reaction. And it says the significant milieu, the significant portion of our social milieu begins with the expansion of European markets. Expansion of European markets. What seems, and then later it says on the social question, the structural foundations of white domination is economic determinism. Now, I wanted to be reconciled here, if possible, because it appears that socialism is being abandoned for some kind of an economic model. I would be interested to hear, how does an Africanist socialist democratic model look like from an economic perspective? In other words, so I sit down, does class analysis vanish from the equation when we deal with the political economic question as Africanists? Or do we find in Sobukwe's text an abandonment of this particular issue? Sobukwe, who spoke clearly, actually, and said that we want to have a state-planned economy, and we want to pursue the most equitable distribution of wealth. So I want to be reconciled with the views that the Prof makes and with the views that were made about Nkrumah.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, hogging the mic, and allow our presenters to attempt to address some of the comments and some of the questions. I don't know whether you want me to assist you summarizing the questions and the comments, but I don't think I want to do that. You should try and handle it. Yeah. So I'm going to call on Alyssa Adams to first address our colleague, and then Mr. Mavundla last.
Okay, thank you guys for your questions. So I think I can address both of them at the same time. Yes, very tricky. So the first one, which was how can we reconcile with Nkrumah's changes throughout his political career? This is a tricky one. I was actually just in Ghana a few days ago, and this is something that they still struggle with as well, because obviously Nkrumah's character, political philosophies, and everything in between changed between the time that he had began his political career and the time that he ended his political career, which I guess happens with a lot of political figures, so that is not surprising at all. How we can reconcile this, I think, is by focusing on the ideology that Nkrumah was focusing on in the time. So rather than following the man, stick to the ideology that you are looking to explore and just go within that. I think the changes that occurred is only natural that his perceptions would change and would differ. But that doesn't discount for the previous work he had done and for the previous beliefs he had, because they do hold weight and they were agreed upon and also investigated on by other Pan-African thinkers. So that is what I would say on that. And then the capitalism, the second question, is a very long question and quite a complex one. I think what we also need to keep in mind with all of these sort of definitions is that they are all Western definitions. So as was mentioned, we are still sticking to a very Western framework of thinking and thinking that what exists are the only possible options that we have. So the idea of African socialism, I explained it from the literature that exists currently, but we should be changing that. We should be looking at our societies now and understanding, what do we need now? What does African socialism really mean now? It doesn't need to be within a specific framework of socialism or of capitalism, but looking at our countries now, our historical backgrounds and our context, what does African socialism mean to us now? And that will be, of course, probably different for each and every country or even individual, but there are some basic principles that we can agree upon. I think most African countries do want a more state-planned economy, but yes, something equitable, something with less socio-economic divisions within our societies. And that is just not possible within a Western liberal system, mainly because in a Western liberal system, it is you progressing yourself within that society, as opposed to society progressing together and everyone progressing at a level in which everyone is afforded basic necessities. So I think that base could be how we conceive African socialism and how we can move forward in creating an economic system that is more in line with our beliefs. I think I've answered the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, comrades. I don't really feel like I had questions, but it's a question of then just the conversation, just to go back. Well, there are differences, right? The PAC is like all other movements in the sense that ideological differences will always emerge amongst comrades, right? And towards the late 80s, there emerges within the PAC what is called the Sobukwe Forum. But the emergence of the Sobukwe Forum is on the basis of that. They say that let us go back to Sobukwe's old Africanism. There are too many Trotskyites, there are too many Maoists, there are too many anarchists in the PAC now. But this is in the external mission. As the program, the Sobukwe Forum wants to go have discussions with the Bantustan leaders. Sobukwe had even said that over and over again that the Bantustan system was a sham independence. But now here was another group within the party rising under his name, but for a very sham approach in itself. I think that amongst ourselves, we generally really have to have that conversation that within these organizations, we sometimes tend to have very different material interests, that some are very good in terms of hiding their material interests, but within our own organizations, and then those material contestations that take place within organizations can take very different forms. We can call each other disaffections, we can call each other whatever we want to call ourselves. But also then, just to go back to the question of the Africanistic socialist democracy, Peter Rabogroko writes a very key document, right? The Africanist case. He says that Africanism, our socialism, basically nationalism dictates that the indigenous must be in control. Socialism dictates that the workers must be in control. Democracy dictates that the majority must rule. When you look at all those three preconditions, it's very easy to see who the core and center of these people are, of these people's struggle. Does class analysis fall away? Is that Mandash asking that? I don't think that class analysis necessarily falls away, right? More especially in the time in which we are in. The Mandash earlier spoke about the fragmentation amongst Africans, but I tend to think about it in the sense that we must also be quite open to the fact that the blacks as a political bloc have become way more differentiated. It is much more difficult. Right now it means that we have to be way much more specific in terms of who is it that's going to lead the struggle. We can't say us anymore. We can't say it's ours. If ever we're going to say ours broadly, who is the core engine of that ours? Which bloc amongst us is able to ensure that it will push the struggle to its ultimate end without wanting to compromise? And in most cases, it tends to be those people that have very unbearable life circumstances. So it therefore means that most of us in here are even potential barriers to the struggle. Thanks, colleagues.
On that note, without stealing a thunder, I'd like to thank my discussants and presenters for a very provocative set of presentations. Let's please give them a round of applause once again. And also for my duty to you all, also just to put it all together. When we think about security, we tend to think of it as hard security, guns, of warfare. But given the hyper-militarized society that we live in, or at least human condition that we live in, this sort of approach could be to the detriment of us all, given the types of weapons and the longevity of these groups in terms of what they can do in warfare. So we must find a way of engaging imperialism in a unique fashion. And some of our conversations, some of our approaches speak to this concept of peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, let me sign off here before I start rambling, and thank you very much for participating in this conversation. Again, they are open, they are human beings and not demigods, so you can approach them and discuss further when you can, these themes and concepts. Thank you very much. I think there's one more theme, it's a big discussion that we will have with our esteemed colleagues. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues. I was just saying, without any waste of time, I'm going to ask the panelists for the next session to come to the front. And as they are doing that, I need to also inform you about the slight amendment to our program, in a sense that one of the panelists is not here, won't make it. The session is about, and was about, I should say, intergenerational conversation on Sobukwe and Pan-Africanism. I'm not so sure whether it's going to be intergenerational now, in the sense that the person that I think was most likely making it intergenerational was Professor Ranwezi Herinengukulu, who has not been able to make it. He might be here. He said he might be here tomorrow. There was a slight confusion in the program. We have apologized to him. Having said that, I need to mention that even though it might not necessarily be intergenerational, but it will definitely be interactive, because I have the two panelists, and then we will open the floor for discussions. My name is Kialebo Hamapunye, and I'm going to be your chair for this session. I'm from the Department of Political Sciences, the other department that maybe you haven't heard much about. We are here also colleagues, yes. The two panelists next to me is Me Lebohang Peko. Diepolo Peko is a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective and a fellow at African Futures Lab. I've got it right. She also wears a lot of other hats, almost like me, like some of us here. So you might know her from wherever you have met her or even encountered her. I also have somebody that needs not much introduction, especially in these shows, if I can use that phrase loosely. Ndate advocate Sipho Ras Mantula, who is from the Thabo Mbeki School of African and International Leadership. We have been accused as the university or university communities, me included, because here I'm here at Unisa, but there are people from other universities here, of being ivory towers, the ivory tower syndrome. In other words, we talk to ourselves. And I often ask colleagues why don't you go and have a discussion like this in Mamelodi or in Soweto or, I don't know, Guguletu, wherever, next to or even in the CBD, where there's a multitude of people who benefit from discussions like this. But of course, there are always, reasons, one way or the other, catering and all those things, security, and you name it, there can be many. As a result, here we are in this ivory tower trying to decipher some of these ideas that have been presented early this morning. 3 questions that I'm going to ask to share with you also as our presenters grapple with them. Firstly, what are the practical manifestations of Pan-Africanism, Afrofuturism, and Afrocentricity? Secondly, what are the contemporary implications of these very terms to us, to the ordinary person in the street, as they normally say? And lastly, or thirdly, what is the relevance of these terms to public discourse, contemporary public discourse, especially to younger people who may not know anything much about Sobukwe, have never met him, don't know anything about his ideas, and maybe by extension we might even ask a question: what would Sobukwe himself say today if he were there today about some of the things that we are talking about, and so on and so on? This morning when Prof. Kapra was speaking and other people were speaking, I was also in my mind, another question was ringing to say, this Sobukwe clause that we are all familiar with, how effective was it? Effective to the colonialists? Because the idea was to mute the person, to clamp down, to destroy, to obliterate, to make sure that the person disappears. But now, Sobukwe clause or no Sobukwe clause, I'm sure there will be other people who will continue interrogating that. And then after this, I'm going to ask each and every one of them to reflect on these issues. So it's a reflective session, in as much as it is also an interactive session. After which I will open the floor for discussions, for questions, for answers. And please listen to them very carefully, because when they finish, I don't want you to make another speech telling me what they have said, but I want you to comment on what they would have said, or maybe to question whatever they have said very briefly. And without any further ado, we heard from Prof. Prague saying this morning that if we don't take care of our languages, they will disappear. Along with us, we will disappear. So in my humble Setswana, we normally say, that means a mother is normally the one who grabs the knife by the sharp end. So I'm going to start with Mepeku to come and give her ideas, and then immediately thereafter ask the advocate also to come in, after which we will then engage them. I thank you.
Dumelang sanibonani. Kwaba quiet. Sure, dumelang sanibonani. Sure, bugani ma-Afrika. This is Azania here. This is a liberated zone here. This is the way that we are going to banish and unbanish those banished voices. We ourselves have to present ourselves as though we are ready for action, as though we are excited to be in this Azanian reality. This is a space of refuge. This is a space of ontological liberation. This is a space where we are able to recover and redeem ourselves. And I'd like to suggest right there that this is the practical manifestation of what Africanism is and what Africanhood means. It actually is, I'd like to pick up from what Ntate Lebohang has been saying, Leboha has been saying, which is to say that when we are thinking around banishment, Africanism is an attempt to unbanish and to rehumanize those who have been dehumanized. It recenters us. It places us as the center of consideration. It reminds the world that African people and Africanhood are not a periphery, as used in developmental speak, but that we are in fact the majority world. I use the term the majority world because in fact, what European and Eurocentrism has done, it has minimized a global majority and an African majority. Pan-Africanism is also a reminder that we are a shape-shifting movement that is in motion all the time. We are in constant dialogue and a dialectic engagement with the past, the present, and the future. And indeed, when we think around some of the contemporary implications, which I'll come to later, it reminds us that we are not only in this moment, but we are planning for the moments that are yet to come and for those who have yet to be born. And then in speaking around then what Africanness actually means in the context of Afrocentricism, it also reminds us of ideas of sovereignty, of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and abolition, but those are not static constructs. These are movements and fights and battles that are always evolving and constantly in motion, just as humanity is in constant motion. Every time we think that the empire has fallen in one way, we raise a flag, we raise an anthem, yet multiple other ways and epistemic violences continue to reassess themselves and continue to assert themselves over our personhood. When we think around as well, Pan-Africanism as an ideation, I'd like to suggest that it is merely an umbrella of multiple streams. It is a church, a mosque, a temple of many denominations. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we try to narrow and to flatten and to minimize Pan-Africanism, because surely billions of Black people, billions of African people in the diaspora, in global Africa, cannot be flattened within a single narrative and a single way of being. We already in previous generations were given by Kenneth Kaunda humanism, for example. We were already in previous generations given by Mwalimu Ujamaa. And we were already in previous generations given the idea of scientific socialism, which this movement, the movement of Ndate Sobukwe, likes to talk about, and which I have a quibble with because it has not been sufficiently contemporized. And I think we do again ourselves as this service by behaving as though and speaking as though and ideating as though and uttering as though we are still somewhere in Addis Ababa in 1962. We are not. The world has moved, and so must our ideation. Now, when we think then around what an Afrocentric stream of thought then looks like, it forces us to think around a social and transformative movement, which is always trying to move away from being a cognitive minority to a cognitive majority. White minority rule and white epistemic minority rule, I believe, is one of the great plagues of humanity. And when I speak of humanity, I also situate this in the context of humanhood, Botho, Ubuntu, as in people of blackness. I think it's also an important framework within which to redeem and reclaim this idea of Ubuntu, which has been bastardized, taken, and orphanized by everybody and anyone who wants to talk about Ubuntu. And I think when we think around what Ubuntu means as a reclamation of the self, it is an idea that talks back to the white gaze because it centers blackness, Africanhood as the center of consideration, as the way of being. Which is why people will often use this expression which says, when you hear you saw somebody and they tripped up or whatever, oh, inelemotu, was it a person? Because it understands that with the community of Botho, Ubuntu, is referring to blackness. And I think for the younger people and the younger scholars who perhaps have been bamboozled by the rainbowism and the rainbow-esque interpretations of Ubuntu, which mean every and anyone, which means anybody, the land belongs to all, we are all people. It is just not true. And Botho, Ubuntu, in its essence, and Afrocentricity in its essence, are reminding us of this cognitive shift and the need for this cognitive shift. And then lastly, to speak then around the Afrofutures as well. And that's the part I think what perhaps the younger people might also, I also wanted to say, one paragraph back, when we're speaking about blackness, I don't refer to Biko Black. I refer to Black. I'm just putting it out there. So then, when we then talk about this whole idea of cognitive power, cognitive liberation, and how then this links into the Afrofutures and African futures, I'm reminded of something that Ndate Sobukwe said at the launch of the party when he said, what have we given birth to here? What is this that is being birthed here? And if we can then imagine him speaking to us today and saying, what have we been given birth to here? What is this, right? And even though Afrofutures have become so interested in the aesthetic of Afrofutures, in culture, in beauty, in the way that African people are presenting themselves. And I think a level of culture vulturization, culture cannibalization, that has then become, that has become the norm. It is normative, it is normal for people across the world to feel that they can occupy Africanhood and African futures in this time and in this place. And yet what African futures give us the opportunity to do is to think around the wrestling and the diasporic imaginings, the freedom, the agency, the ways of being, the multiple narratives and the multiple possibilities of what it means to be a black person anywhere in this world, today, tomorrow, or in the future, in perpetuity. Afrofutures give us the potential to think, what are we going to be? What have we been birthing? And what are we birthing from day to day? It's also the intersectionality of ways to imagine, to plan, and to anticipate African liberation as a global project. I think that it's across all of these constellations, though, I have to say that it is required that there be a womanist and feminist intersection of self-determination, of anti-oppression, and of anti-imperialism, understanding that without the centrality of a womanist, feminist agenda, we are going to be exactly where we are now, which is a strange place between here and there, nowhere and everywhere. I'll leave it there.
Molweni dumelang ma Africa. I don't know what to say after my daughter of the fertile soil have just breaking the space. By just picking up what you have said, banishment, historical context of Sobukwe and the practical implication is that we cannot talk of Pan-African unity, of Pan-Africanism, and others have spoken about African Renaissance in the 60s and alluded only to Thabo Mbeki and Cheikh Anta Diop, and they leave Sobukwe. That will be a serious mistake. The second aspect is that I speak here coming from one of the areas where Sobukwe was banished in 1960. Komafikeng in a farm on the 25th of March. Very historical context. The second aspect is that 2 days from now we will have been talking about the Sobukwe trial, which I think my elder brother Tondol Luvoyo will touch on that trial of Sobukwe on the 4th of April, which is the last day of this meeting of minds. Very important historical context. The second one, the third aspect, Prof, you spoke about Sobukwe clause. It is also the 60 years of Sobukwe clause where the parliament debated Sobukwe clause in 1964. And that Sobukwe clause was specifically for Sobukwe as he was a man of magnetic personality. A man who was dangerous until the side of eternity. Going back to the key question, the practical implication. I think the AU 2013, they were obsessed with this notion of the Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance with Agenda 2063. And we are in 2024. That notion came at the AU in 2013. All countries who are part of the AU, including Azania, we have never translated what is Pan-Africanism, what is African Renaissance, or what is this rebirth. Contemporary implication, I think if one has to do this conversation, if the elders were here, maybe they would have said to us, the same contemporary challenges we are having is what we struggled with in the 60s. The land question, the economic growth, the education curriculum. They will have raised those issues once more. The issues of the law, how the law was colonial, how the law was European in dealing with the character or the human being called Mangaliso Sobukwe. The new concepts that are coming, I don't think nothing is new under the sun or the moon, whether Afrofuturism, Afropolitan, modernity, all those concepts, I think they've lost a meaning of us understanding that there was no Pan-Africanism, it was Pan-African unity. It was all about the knowledge of Africans. Hence, we kept on defining who are Africanists all the time. So as the themes that we were talking about, Prof, that people were talking about, the Pan-Africanism, diaspora, or the living spora, that's where the link of Marcus Garvey becomes relevant. That people cannot talk about Marcus Garvey. His implication to both the Pan-African community, the Black consciousness community, those themes are still relevant. But the digital world that we are in, the Afrofuturism that we are in, might also be a danger of forgetting the first principles or the first groundings, which is the Pan-Africanism, which is the African Renaissance. That middle passage, that journey that Haile Gerima of Ethiopia said, we have to be those birds that look back, but going forward, Sankofa. Those are the implications that we have to be looking at and at those themes. I looked at the question also of where Africa is, the post-colonial Africa with these economic sanctions, which I think my sister was clear that we are in the cultural hegemony, we are in cultural domination by the West, that even when we have to call the Pan-Africanist conference, it is held by the French, it is led by the French, like Togo and Ghana, they've been contesting around that. South Africa also have been contesting, and Uganda. Whenever you have to have a Pan-African Congress, or what you call an international Pan-African meeting of minds. We've been having that contestation for years in this country. You are privileged to have Professor Kwesi Kwapra, the late Professor Daniwa Dada Nabudere from Uganda, I want to remind you, Zan, we were in that meeting in some uptown hotel. And he said, you know what, we need to remove the Pan-African project from the political vultures. Simpio, you were there. When he said, the Pan-African project of 1990 in Dhaka, in Kampala, of Tuji, who's that? Yes, Tajuddin and Museveni, Kagame, that generation that came in the early 90s. 1994, actually 30 years later, they captured what was supposed to be the People's Project or the Community Project, and they took it to be the State Power Project. That's where the Pan-Africanism, even of Thabo Mbeki, when he came with African Renaissance as a foreign policy, it was misconstrued, it was misinterpreted. Jacob Zuma came with this foreign policy of Ubuntu, another misinterpretation done by white universities, to draft our foreign policy, and only the last paragraph of foreign policy, you only get Ubuntu. The same like African Renaissance as a foreign policy, it lacked the Pan-African ethos and principles. And that's why you can say it is still relevant, it is still practical. Its contemporary implications is what we see now in the wave of military coups in the Sahel region, that these young people are trying to question parliamentary system, presidential system, but they don't have a clear system. And I think here having elders like Prof. Ramos, last week I kept on using your terms, Prof, of democracy. We are in the state of democracy, which is the rule of money by politicians to gain power. They use money to be in power. So we are not in the state of Ubuntu-cracy. We are in the state of what Fela Kuti said is a state of demonstration of craziness. There's no democracy. It's the state of demonstration of craziness, of stealing ideas, stealing concepts, misinterpreting concepts, and also universities are that site of struggles, and they are the sites of misinterpretation also. Universities are also playing a role of undermining the Pan-African projects. This university, if one has to raise a concern, why did we kill Achima Feje Institute? Or relocated it, or just put it that aside? When Achima Feje fought the apartheid system of education in the 1960s at UCT. So if you ask yourself, does it mean Achima Feje was not relevant on the Pan-African knowledge trajectory? People like that I've mentioned, like Daniwa Dada, Nabudere, who worked with Unisa also and worked with many universities. You look at the South Sudanese scholars who also were harvesting from this university. I remember in one of the sessions, they were